If you're feeling worn out, take a moment to rest and let these stories carry you away. They might ease your mind and help you drift into peaceful sleep. For the best experience, wear headphones and let the world fade for a while. My name's Justin Murphy, and this took place in 2020 just outside Waterton Lakes National Park on the Canadian side of the border. The mountains had been calling me out for years, but this was the first time I had the freedom to just drive my RV out here, park, and let the wilderness drown out the noise of city life. 45, single, no kids, and for once in my life, no one to answer to. It was heaven, or so I thought. I just didn't expect that I'd be standing so close to hell too. The park was almost deserted. It was late in the season, chilly, but not too cold, with fewer visitors than I'd hoped. But for a guy looking to get away from everything, I didn't mind the emptiness. My RV was parked in a spot a little away from the main campground, under the shadows of the towering pines and surrounded by the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. By the second day, though, I noticed something was off. In the distance, I saw a couple of crows circling something near an old hiking trail. Not a big deal out here, but there was an unusual energy around it. I decided to follow the path and check things out. Maybe I was just looking for a distraction, but curiosity is a strange thing when you're alone in the woods. After a few minutes' hike, I found what had grabbed the crow's attention: a torn backpack, half buried under some leaves, with clothes scattered around as if someone had left in a hurry. It looked fresh, and I found it odd. If it was from a recent camper, wouldn't they have filed a report by now? Well, I took a quick look around and figured someone probably had an unlucky encounter with a bear or had just panicked. But the next morning, the same crows were back, and this time they were closer to my RV. They weren't circling, they were perched, staring down at me like they were waiting for something. One even swooped down to land on my windshield, just staring through the glass like it knew something I didn't. Now, I'm not superstitious, but it was unsettling, and I decided to pack up and move a few miles away. I found another spot near the banks of a stream. It was peaceful there, with just the sound of the water rushing over rocks, and for a moment, I forgot the odd feeling that had been building since I found that bag. I spent the rest of the day fishing, hoping to catch something for dinner. As I sat there, a ranger I hadn't seen before showed up. He was tall, probably in his 50s, with scruffy dark hair and a jacket that looked older than I was. He was built tough and had a face like he'd seen more than his fair share of rough days. He didn't smile, didn't greet me, just nodded. "You here alone?" He asked in a voice as dry as the air. His tone wasn't friendly. It was almost accusatory, like I'd done something wrong. "Yeah," I replied, just trying to enjoy some quiet time. He looked at me, his eyes lingering, then muttered, "Watch yourself around here. Not everyone comes back from these woods." He turned and walked off before I could ask any more questions. Now, I'm no stranger to dark humor. I get it. Rangers have their own jokes, especially around city guys like me. But his delivery was cold, too serious to be a joke, and it left me feeling more than a little uneasy. That night, as I sat in my RV, the forest seemed to close in tighter. Every little sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of a leaf, felt amplified, like the woods were shifting around me. I tried to brush it off, but something gnawed at the back of my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Just past midnight, there was a soft knock on the RV door. I thought maybe it was that ranger coming back to scare me again. I opened the door, and to my surprise, there was a woman standing there, probably in her mid-30s, wrapped in a filthy coat. Her eyes darted around, and she looked desperate. "Please," she whispered, "you have to help me. They're looking for me." I froze. She had cuts on her face, her hands were trembling, and she looked half-starved. "Who's looking for you?" I asked, stepping out of the RV and looking around, expecting someone to appear out of the darkness. "They?" She trailed off, glancing over her shoulder. Please, I don't have much time." I grabbed a blanket and handed it to her. "Let's get inside," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The hairs on my neck were standing on end, but I wasn't about to turn her away. Once she was inside, I locked the door and started asking questions. But she didn't make much sense. She mumbled about people watching her, following her, and how she'd been hiding for days. She said something about the others, people who had been missing like her, drawn into the woods. She kept looking out the window, her hands clenching and unclenching like she expected someone to break in at any moment. I tried to calm her down, but then I heard a sound outside, heavy footsteps circling the RV, slow and deliberate, like someone was taking their time. My heart pounded as I peeked out the window, only to see that ranger again, standing just a few feet away, staring right at me. "What are you doing?" I called out, trying to mask my fear with bravado. No answer. He just kept staring, his face unreadable. After what felt like an eternity, he turned and walked off into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. I watched him go, half relieved, half terrified. When I turned back to the woman, she was curled up on the couch, wide-eyed and shaking. "He's one of them," she whispered. "One of the people they send out to find us." That night felt like it lasted forever. I kept the lights off, too scared to attract attention, and I barely slept. By dawn, she had slipped away, disappearing as mysteriously as she'd appeared. I tried to rationalize everything, convince myself it was some kind of sick joke or that she was just another camper gone paranoid from isolation. But when I went outside to pack up, I found her blanket on the ground, smeared with blood. I decided it was time to leave, but my RV wouldn't start. Not a chance. I checked the engine, but nothing looked wrong. It was as if someone had tampered with it, but I had no tools, no way to fix it out here. That's when the ranger showed up again. This time, he didn't bother with greetings. He stood there, hands in his pockets, staring at me with a look I can only describe as predatory. "Looks like you're stuck here," he said, his tone colder than before. I tried to stay calm, but my voice wavered. "Mind giving me a hand? Looks like something's wrong with the engine." He tilted his head as if weighing my request. "Maybe, but it might be best if you just stayed here. Lots of people find these woods comforting." I felt the chill run through me. "I'm not planning to stay," I said, trying to stand my ground. He just shrugged and walked away, leaving me stranded and alone. I spent the next hour trying everything I could think of to get the RV running, but nothing worked. The woods felt oppressive, as if the trees were closing in, and every rustle made me jump. It was getting dark, and I had no choice but to wait for morning. Around midnight, I heard something, a low dragging sound, as if someone was pulling something heavy through the dirt. It was coming from the direction of the trail where I'd found the torn backpack. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out against my better judgment. The sound was closer now, and I swung the beam of light around, half expecting to see that ranger, but it wasn't him. Instead, there was a figure in the distance, a woman dragging what looked like a large burlap sack. She stopped when she saw me, dropping the sack, which hit the ground with a heavy, sickening thud. "Help me," she whispered, her voice carrying through the cold night air. I was frozen, torn between running and helping her. She looked like she hadn't eaten in days, her face hollow and pale. Before I could make a decision, I heard a voice behind me. "Get inside. Now." I turned, and the ranger was standing just a few feet away, his face twisted in a strange, almost hungry expression. I backed away, stumbling over my own feet as I tried to get back to the RV, but the woman, the one with the burlap sack, was gone. The ranger approached slowly, his footsteps unhurried. I scrambled into the RV and locked the door, but he just stood outside, smiling like he had all the time in the world. Then he knocked softly, patiently. "Come on, Justin," he said, using my name. "No one will believe you if you make it out of here. You're already part of the forest." The knocking continued, rhythmic and persistent. My heart pounded in my chest as the ranger's voice drifted through the thin walls of the RV, each word calm and deliberate. He kept knocking, soft and steady, as if he had all the time in the world. I backed away from the door, clutching a wrench I'd found in the drawer, a flimsy weapon, but it was all I had. Then the knocking stopped. Silence hung heavy in the air, thick enough to choke on. I strained my ears, waiting for some sound of him moving away, for his footsteps retreating, but there was nothing. My hands were slick with sweat, the wrench slipping slightly as I held it tighter. Just as I dared to peek out the window, a loud bang echoed from the rear of the RV. I whipped around, breath catching in my throat. Another bang, louder this time, came from the side. He was circling, testing every weak spot like a predator cornering prey. "Justin," his voice came from somewhere outside. "It's time to come out. You're wasting everyone's time." I inched back toward the driver's seat, frantically pulling at the keys, praying the RV would start up. Nothing, just the hollow clicks of the dead engine. The door's lock handle jiggled and I felt my stomach drop. I thought about running out the back, but as I reached for the latch, I noticed something on the floor, a smudged, bloody handprint leading to the back storage compartment. It was fresh. I hadn't seen it earlier, but now, under the dim glow of the flashlight, I realized the woman from before must have hidden something, or someone, inside. The compartment was barely big enough to fit a person, but she'd squeezed someone into it. I braced myself and opened it. The smell hit me like a punch. The body inside was twisted, barely recognizable, eyes wide and frozen in terror. A deep gash ran across the neck, the edges jagged like it had been hacked by something rough. It was her. The bile rose in my throat, but I didn't have time to process. Outside, the ranger's voice grew softer, almost a whisper. "You've found her, haven't you?" I stumbled back. The image of her lifeless eyes seared into my mind. I slammed the compartment shut, backing away as I heard the door creak. The lock gave way, and I threw myself against the cabinet, hiding in the narrow space between the fridge and the wall, praying he wouldn't find me. My breathing was shallow, each inhale barely more than a gasp. The door creaked open. His heavy boots thudded against the floor as he stepped inside, taking his time. I could see his shadow shifting as he looked around, humming a tuneless melody. "Come out, Justin," he cooed, his voice sickly sweet. "She came here to hide too. Didn't work out for her either." I held my breath, every muscle in my body clenched so tight it hurt. He was getting closer, the weight of each step shaking the floor. I gripped the wrench, waiting, hoping he wouldn't notice the faint sound of my shallow breaths. The flashlight beam scanned the room, gliding over the walls and stopping inches from my hiding spot. But then he paused. His attention shifted to the bloody handprint on the floor. A smile twisted across his face as he bent down to inspect it, running his finger along the dried blood. "It's a shame, really," he muttered. "They all think they're so clever, finding places to hide." Before he could turn back toward me, I seized my chance. I swung the wrench down with everything I had, striking him square on the back of his head. He staggered, grunting as he collapsed forward. I didn't waste a second. I bolted past him, pushing out the door and into the fresh night air. I ran, my legs burning as I sprinted down the unmarked trail. The forest was a blur, branches tearing at my clothes and face, but I kept going. Somewhere behind me, I could hear him stumbling to his feet, cursing as he followed. I didn't look back. At last, I saw the dim glow of a road up ahead. It was empty, stretching in both directions, but I didn't care. I ran toward it, flagging down the first headlights I saw. A rusty pickup truck slowed as it approached. The driver, a burly bearded man, stared at me, bewildered. "Please," I gasped, waving him down. "Help me. There's a man in the woods. He's killing people." The driver hesitated but saw the panic in my eyes and gestured for me to get in. "Where?" he asked, already turning the truck around. I pointed back toward the forest, catching my breath. "He's at my RV, out on the eastern trails. There's a body inside the RV, a woman." He nodded, gripping the wheel tight as he sped toward the park ranger station, calling in backup on his radio. I slumped in the passenger seat, relief flooding over me. For the first time, I thought I might actually survive this. As we reached the ranger station, several officers were already waiting. They listened to my story, grim-faced, and organized a team to search the woods. Hours later, they found my RV and the compartment with the woman's body, but the ranger was gone, leaving nothing but the echoes of his threats in the trees. In the aftermath, the police shared some details they dug up. The ranger, Jeff Connolly, was an ex-ranger who'd been dismissed a decade ago after a series of campers had gone missing under mysterious circumstances. He'd simply vanished after his termination, slipping into the dense wilderness where he knew every trail and hiding spot like the back of his hand. As for why he did it, the officers believed he saw himself as the guardian of some twisted wilderness justice, punishing those who entered his territory without permission. He thought of himself as judge, jury, and executioner. Before we dive into the next exciting story, drop a comment below and let me know, what time is it where you're watching from? I'm curious to see where everyone's tuning in from around the world. My name's Richard Jones, and back in 2008, I decided to take a solo RV trip through the rough back roads of Oregon's Zoco National Forest. I was itching for an adventure, something to remind me I was alive. I'll admit I hadn't exactly lived life on the wild side, but I was always game for a challenge. I was the kind of guy who considered fixing my own coffee machine a risk worth bragging about. Still, something about the wilderness called to me in a way that suburbia just didn't. This trip was supposed to be a simple escape from city noise and cell service, with no company but the trees, my thoughts, and a paperback I had been trying to finish for over a year. I was barely 2 hours into the journey when I hit the first snag, a flat tire. It was irritating, but I had a spare, so I got to work and managed to fix it without too much cussing. The real trouble came about an hour later when I pulled into a secluded spot to set up camp, only to find it wasn't as empty as I had expected. There was a rusty old RV parked on the other side of the clearing, barely visible behind a stand of trees. A man was sitting on a folding chair outside, skin dark from years in the sun, wiry frame hidden under layers of tattered clothes. He looked like he'd been there for days, maybe weeks. I gave him a quick nod, trying not to stare, but I couldn't help noticing the half smirk on his face, like he'd been waiting for someone. I set up my RV, making sure to put a solid distance between us. I'd run into plenty of odd characters on past trips, but something about this guy unsettled me. Maybe it was the way he didn't look away, or the fact that he didn't seem to have any gear around him. No food, no water, nothing but that chair and his RV. As the evening stretched on, I tried to distract myself with my book, but I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see him standing right there. Around dusk, I heard footsteps outside, followed by a knock on my door. I peered through the window and saw him standing there, hand raised as if he'd been about to knock again. Against my better judgment, I opened the door a crack and asked if he needed anything. He tilted his head, eyes glinting in the fading light, and said in a voice rough as gravel, "Just thought you might want some company out here. It's lonely, you know." His words sounded casual, but there was something off about his tone, too friendly, too insistent. I mumbled something about having plans for the night and shut the door, locking it twice for good measure. Through the window, I watched as he shrugged and strolled back to his own RV, whistling a tune I couldn't quite place. The evening passed slowly, and every so often I heard faint sounds from his direction, a scrape, a muffled laugh, a quiet murmur that could have been a conversation. But when I looked out, there was no one else. By midnight, I was on edge, but exhaustion eventually pulled me under, and I fell asleep. I woke to a loud bang that rattled the whole RV. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming, but the banging continued, coming from the back of my vehicle. I scrambled out of bed, heart pounding, and peered through the back window. He was there, standing so close his breath fogged the glass, his face twisted in an expression that looked like a mix of anger and delight. "Let me in," he hissed, voice barely audible but sharp enough to slice through my panic. I grabbed the only weapon I had, a rusted crowbar I kept for emergencies, and held it tight, willing myself to stay calm. When he didn't get an answer, he started circling the RV, tapping his knuckles along the walls as if searching for a weak spot. My mind raced, running through every possible escape plan, but each one ended the same way, with him finding a way inside. I was trapped, and he knew it. After what felt like hours, he stopped and muttered something under his breath, loud enough for me to hear one word: tomorrow. Then he walked back to his RV, leaving me in a silence so thick I could barely breathe. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping the crowbar like it was my lifeline. The next morning, I packed up and prepared to leave as fast as I could. But just as I was about to start the engine, I glanced in the mirror and saw him standing there, blocking the road with his arms crossed. I was in no mood to play games, so I honked the horn, hoping he'd take the hint and move. Instead, he walked over to my window, that same smirk on his face. "Going somewhere?" he asked, voice dripping with mock innocence. I told him I had an emergency back home, something that required me to leave immediately. He He just chuckled, shaking his head slowly. "You're not going anywhere," he whispered so low I almost didn't catch it. "This place has a way of keeping people." I clenched the wheel, resisting the urge to slam the gas and plow through him, but his gaze pinned me in place, as if he knew I didn't have the nerve. I don't know what possessed me to try reasoning with him, but I found myself saying, "Look, I don't want any trouble. I just came here to relax." "Trouble finds people like you," he replied, voice darkening. "City folk always thinking they're safe behind locks and fences. Out here, none of that means anything." He took a step back, eyes scanning the RV like he was sizing it up, then walked back to his own vehicle. I didn't waste another second. I started the engine, ready to peel out, but when I tried to shift into drive, the gears jammed, grinding in a way that sounded almost intentional. I could see him in my side mirror, leaning against his RV, arms crossed, watching with that same smirk. I cursed under my breath, fighting with the gear stick, but it was no use. It was stuck. I climbed out, planning to check under the hood, but as soon as I did, he was beside me, moving so silently I didn't even hear him approach. "Need a hand?" he asked, tone dripping with mock concern. I backed away, heart hammering, but he just laughed, low and mean, like he knew exactly how much power he had. He grabbed a wrench from his pocket and offered it to me, handle first. I stared at it, wondering if this was some kind of trap, but he just stood there, waiting. When I finally took it, he stepped back, arms raised in mock surrender. "Go on," he said. "Try and fix it." With shaking hands, I opened the hood and took a look, but I barely knew what I was doing. The engine looked fine, at least to my untrained eyes, but every time I tried to start it, the gears jammed again. And every time I looked up, he was there, just watching, arms crossed, smirk fixed on his face like he was savoring every second of my frustration. After nearly an hour, I gave up, muttering something about calling a tow. He chuckled again, shaking his head. "No service out here," he said. "You're stuck. Might as well get comfortable." I considered walking, but the nearest town was miles away, and I didn't trust him not to follow. So I stayed, nerves frayed, waiting for night to fall, knowing I wouldn't be able to sleep with him so close. As darkness crept in, I locked every door, every window, praying it would be enough. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again, soft but deliberate, circling the RV like a predator sizing up its prey. Then came the tapping, knuckles rapping against the windows, the roof, the doors. I gripped the crowbar, sweat slicking my palms, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, almost guttural laugh, and then his voice, muffled but unmistakable. "Come on out, city boy. Let's see what you're made of." I held my breath, willing him to leave, but the silence that followed felt even worse. Minutes stretched into hours, and still he lingered, pacing outside, muttering to himself. At some point, exhaustion claimed me, and I slipped into a fitful sleep. I woke to the smell of smoke. Panicking, I scrambled out of bed and saw flames licking at the back of my RV. I grabbed the fire extinguisher and managed to put it out before it spread, but my heart sank when I realized it had been set intentionally. A small bundle of sticks and rags lay at the base, charred and smoking. A crude attempt at arson. The man was nowhere in sight, but I knew he hadn't gone far. I packed up what little I could carry, deciding then and there to abandon the RV and hike back to civilization. I'd barely made it a mile when I heard footsteps behind me, quick and heavy, gaining fast. I turned, crowbar raised, and saw him there, eyes gleaming with something between anger and glee. He lunged, and we grappled, my grip slipping as he pushed me to the ground. Desperation lent me strength, and I swung the crowbar, catching him in the leg. He stumbled, cursing, but before he could recover, I bolted. The forest seemed endless, trees blurring together as I ran, heart hammering, lungs burning. I could hear him crashing through the underbrush behind me, his voice taunting, mocking, daring me to keep running. Somehow, I made it to the edge of the forest where a patrol truck was parked. The ranger inside took one look at me, bloodied, breathless, and didn't ask questions. He radioed for backup, and within minutes, the area was swarming with officers. They found the man near my RV, muttering to himself, hands stained with dirt and ash. Turns out he'd been squatting in the forest for years, attacking anyone who wandered too close. As they hauled him away, he looked at me, eyes full of that same twisted delight. and whispered, "This place doesn't like strangers." The ranger told me later they found remnants of old campsites littered with bones, tools, and even a few wallets. Apparently, I hadn't been his first target, just the first to escape. After a long silence, the ranger asked if I wanted to keep any of the belongings they'd found scattered around. I told him I'd pass. My name is Mark Norman, and it all took place back in 1989 on the Gila River Indian Reservation in Arizona when I was 23 and living in a battered trailer not far from the Tribal Education Center, trying to piece my life together after dropping out of trade school and feeling about as confident in my future as a three-legged coyote stumbling across the desert. I remember that morning clearly because I woke up nursing a mild hangover after an evening spent laughing at my own expense with my cousin Tai over cheap beers. Apparently, I'm quite good at telling jokes about my terrible sense of direction and my inability to keep my truck's engine running for more than a week without something rattling loose. I stepped outside and the early light settled on the pale dirt, cracked and dry. The cottonwood trees scattered along the riverbank stretched thin branches over shallow, slow-moving water. A group of children played a half-hearted game of tag 100 yards away, their laughter drifting by, small and harmless. By the time I reached the old wooden bench where I usually sipped my instant coffee, I noticed our neighbor Asa walking toward me, looking uneasy and pale as if he had swallowed a hornet. Asa, a short man with long graying braids, slowed down as he approached. He tried to speak, but his voice came out in a faint whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Makai, we've got a problem near the old ranger shed." He shuffled his feet, his eyes darting behind me as if he expected something to leap out of the trailer's shadow. I joked that if this was about my truck parts going missing again, I'd probably just blame my mechanical incompetence. He didn't even smirk. I set my coffee down, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. We headed out on foot, following a dusty path that wound through brittle shrubs and patches of brittle grass. About 20 minutes in, Asa pointed toward a shape on the ground. As we got closer, the shape revealed itself to be Raymond, a young man from the community who sometimes helped me with odd jobs, hauling water barrels, fixing fence posts. He lay still in the dirt. I knelt beside him and saw that he would never help anyone again. His chest had deep gashes, jagged and violent. There were no bullet holes or shell casings, no footprints that made any sense. Something had torn him open as if he were no more than a burlap sack. Before I knew it, Asa stumbled back, muttering a phrase in our language that roughly means, "The darkness walks." I didn't know what to think. I tried to steady myself, but I kept picturing last night's jokes. They felt twisted now, as if laughter had no place in this world. Back at the reservation's main hall, I spoke with a tribal policeman named Keel, a tall man with a calm voice who usually broke up petty disputes and sometimes ran errands for the elders. He listened, nodded, and then took a long drag from a cigarette. He shook his head as if this murder was beyond his experience. "You sure it wasn't a big cat, Makai? A mountain lion?" I tried to explain that the cuts were too strange and uneven, that the body looked as though something almost experimental had happened. Keel frowned and said we should check it out that afternoon. I told him I would join him, even though I had no weapon and no training. I didn't own a gun. The few times I handled firearms were at my uncle's ranch, and he never let me keep one. Besides, my paycheck was always too small to invest in something like that. Instead, I grabbed an old hatchet with a splintered handle that I kept under my kitchen sink. I held it and gave Asa a forced half grin. I guess I'm the poor man's superhero, Hatchet Man, ready to save the day. Asa responded with a forced chuckle that sounded more like he was trying not to cry. That afternoon, Keel and I inspected Raymond's body again. Keel's radio crackled, and he learned a second body had been found near the old church ruins, a woman named Nara, older, quiet, dead with the same vicious wounds. Keel's jaw tensed. He said we needed help, maybe someone from outside the reservation. But the tribal leader, an old, no-nonsense woman named Elsie, insisted we try to handle it ourselves first. She believed something roamed our lands, something that smelled of old stories and broken promises. I was stunned by her calmness, so I tried to lighten the mood. If we live through this, Elsie, remind me not to quit my day job to become a tour guide. She snorted once. That was something. By early evening, word spread through the small community. People gathered in small clusters, whispering theories. Someone said they saw strange tracks near a dried mud patch, prints too large for a coyote, too narrow for a bear. Another swore they heard shrieks in the distance. Keel asked me to help him keep watch that night. Asa joined us, carrying his father's old rifle. I teased him. Asa, just don't shoot me by accident. I'm no expert, but I'm fairly certain I'm too ugly to be mistaken for anything else. He muttered something about my hatchet and how I looked more scared than heroic. I couldn't argue. We found a spot near the ranger's old shed, a rickety structure with peeling paint and a sagging roof. The air cooled and the sky turned the color of a bruised peach. I waited, eyes drifting from one dark shape to another. Hours passed. The distant hum of cars on the highway barely reached us. Somewhere, an old generator chugged, powering a single light in a distant cabin. I tried to keep my mind busy. I thought about my grandfather, who always scolded me for cutting corners in my daily work. I thought about my cousin Ty's one-liners, his bad puns about rattlesnakes, they're so hysterical, and how he managed to poke fun at my love life, or lack thereof, whenever he had a chance. Then Keel tapped my shoulder. He nodded toward the darkness beyond a stand of mesquite trees. A shape moved there, a large figure low to the ground. Asa lifted his rifle. I gripped my hatchet as it approached. Moonlight touched its form. It resembled a massive canine, maybe something like a wolf, but it had an oddly elongated body, as if someone had stretched a coyote's frame too far. The fur looked patchy, and its front legs had what appeared to be bony protrusions near the joints. It had no fear of us. It moved closer, shoulders rolling under its hide. I wanted to say something clever, something that would break the terror, but my throat tightened. I only managed a hiss of air. Asa fired a shot. It missed. The thing darted sideways in a blur. Keel cursed under his breath. I tried to circle around, my boots kicking up dust. The creature moved so fast I barely saw it. Then I heard Asa cry out. I turned and saw him on the ground, bleeding from the shoulder, his rifle flung aside. The beast struck again, jaws snapping like a trap. The sound reminded me of someone violently cracking a bone. I raised my hatchet and rushed forward, shouting nonsense as if my voice could scare it. The beast pivoted, and I caught a glimpse of its face, like a fox, but warped. Its eyes reflected no kindness. Its teeth looked like they could shred metal. Keel tried to tackle it, failing miserably. The creature leaped over him, landing with a thud. I swung my hatchet in a desperate arc. It slammed into the creature's flank. The blade didn't sink deep enough. The creature snarled and struck Keel's leg, dragging him several feet before I managed another strike. This time I aimed at the neck area, hacking wildly. I felt hot liquid splash my face. It smelled foul, like rotten meat. The creature released Keel and staggered, but didn't run. Instead, it tried to snap at me. I backpedaled, nearly tripping over Asa's rifle. Asa groaned, struggling to stand. I kicked the rifle toward him. He snatched it and fired 2 shots. One must have hit the creature because it screamed in a shrill, unnatural tone, then lowered its head and came at me again. I swung the hatchet, connecting with its jaw. Cracking bone, a terrible shudder ran through it. It backed away, then lunged sideways at Asa, who fired again at close range. The bullet took a chunk of fur and flesh from its side. Now it looked injured and uncertain. I yelled something ridiculous. I hope you're not here to sell life insurance. A shaky, useless joke, but it steadied my nerves for one critical second. I stepped forward, hatchet raised, and struck the creature's skull with everything I had. The handle broke in my hand. The creature collapsed, twitching, then fell still. We waited, panting. I knelt beside Keel, who bled from his leg. Asa clutched his shoulder. We needed help soon. A few others arrived, drawn by the gunshots. They found us around the carcass. Elsie came, her face grim but relieved to see us alive. I half expected someone to crack a joke about my broken hatchet, or ask if we'd set a new record for worst teamwork in a fight, but no one did. Instead, Elsie looked at the dead creature and muttered a prayer. She asked what it looked like. I described it like a coyote stretched too thin, warped into something worse. She nodded as if she had expected something terrible. Keel and Asa were carried to a makeshift infirmary. I limped back to my trailer, my hands shaking. I washed my face and tried to calm my racing heart. Early the next morning, a small group gathered to examine the body. It definitely wasn't a normal animal. It had no tags, no signs of disease that they recognized, just twisted flesh and bone. The tribe's leaders decided to burn it, to let no one else see it. We agreed there was no point in inviting outsiders who might just use as an excuse to mock our community or spin wild stories. Before they set it on fire, I stared at that thing's lifeless form. I wondered what made it hunt us. Maybe it belonged to some hidden population in these deserts, creatures evolved in secret corners of the land. Maybe it followed the scent of human life, easy prey to tear apart. Perhaps it had a reason, some instinctual pattern, maybe hunger, territoriality, or even a strange adaptation to the harsh environment. I could only guess. When we scattered its ashes, the reservation felt quieter. Asa recovered, sporting a bandaged shoulder and cursing his bad luck. Keel ended up with a limp, but he laughed when I said I was as reliable as a broken carburetor. People asked fewer questions than I expected. We shared a sense that we had confronted something beyond ordinary explanation. Life went on. I went back to tinkering with my truck, telling self-deprecating jokes about how I survived a fight with an ugly beast, but still couldn't fix a radiator. The community healed in its own way, though no one forgot what happened. By sunset, I sat again outside my trailer, sipping terrible coffee, remembering that shrill cry and the unnatural shape of that creature. I thought of how it attacked without fear, how it killed without hesitation. Maybe it was driven by instincts we couldn't imagine, guided by hunger or pain or something else entirely. Maybe it had been forced out of its hidden den by scarcity and desperation. I would never know for sure, but I knew this. We fought back, we endured, and we kept our small world intact. My grandfather would have called that a kind of success. As I sat there, I felt no laughter ready on my tongue, no immediate joke to tell. But I did feel something else, an odd sense of calm, a certainty that my place here, uncertain as it might be, was still worth defending. The mist rolled in quicker than I'd expected, but I didn't mind. I loved the fog, loved the way it muted everything, softened the edges of the world, made it all feel a little more mysterious. It was perfect for my project. Whispers of the Wild was going to be my best work yet. I could feel it after everything I'd been through in the past year. Hell, in the past month. This was the reset I needed. Just me, my camera, and the Smoky Mountains. No one to answer to, no one to lean on, just the way I liked it. I hefted my backpack higher on my shoulders and adjusted my camera strap. The trail was rough, more overgrown than I'd expected, but that was part of the draw. The more remote the location, the better the shot. No tourists ruining the landscape with their neon jackets or loud conversations, just untouched wilderness. But untouched wilderness had its downsides. My camera had been acting up since I'd arrived. I'd missed some great shots because of it. Fog rolling over the peaks, a hawk perched on a branch just feet away. But I told myself I didn't care. This trip wasn't about getting everything right. It was about getting away. I paused to catch my breath and set the camera down on a fallen log. The lens fogged up almost instantly in the damp air, and when I wiped it off with a corner of my jacket, I realized I'd smeared dirt across it. Typical. "Come on," I muttered, digging into my bag for a lens cloth. As I crouched there, rubbing at the stubborn streak of mud, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was a woodpecker. There were plenty of them around these parts, but it didn't sound right. Too slow, too steady. Tap, pause, tap, pause. I looked up, but the fog was thickening, swallowing the trees just a few yards ahead of me. The tapping stopped. I told myself it was just a branch knocking against a tree in the wind. I wasn't scared of being out here alone. In fact, I preferred it. No one to distract me, no one to get in my head. Still, the silence that followed felt too quiet, like something was waiting. I shoved the lens cloth back into my pack and stood up, forcing myself to move on. I had a campsite to reach before dark, and I wasn't about to get spooked by a weird noise, at least not this early in the trip. The fog never really lifted by the time I reached the clearing where I planned to camp. It was so thick I could barely see 10 feet in any direction. I set up my tent quickly, more out of habit than anything else, though I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I wasn't sure why. There was no one around, no animals scurrying through the underbrush, not even a bird call to break the stillness. I figured a good night's sleep would shake off the nerves. I was just tired. The last few months had been brutal, breaking up with Paul, the constant fights before it, the way he made me feel like I couldn't do anything right. This trip was supposed to be my way of proving him wrong, proving to myself that I didn't need him, that I didn't need anyone. But the anxiety crept up on me anyway, a tight knot in my chest as I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the ceiling of my tent. Then there was that tapping again, faint and far off. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, just the wind, just the forest. But then it stopped abruptly, like someone had flipped a switch, and I heard something else, something worse. A whisper. It was so faint I could barely make it out, but it was there, threading through the fog outside. It didn't sound like words, not exactly, but it was too rhythmic to be winning, too deliberate. I sat up, listening hard, my heart racing. Nothing. I grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it through the thin walls of the tent. Just mist and shadows. The whispering stopped, but the silence that followed felt alive, thick with something I couldn't name. I switched off the light, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I packed up quickly. I wasn't scared, I told myself. I just wanted to get moving. The fog had lifted slightly, but the forest felt wrong somehow, like it was holding its breath. I didn't like it. I wanted to get to higher ground, get some better shots, and move on. By midday, I'd made it to a rocky ridge that overlooked a valley. It was beautiful, exactly the kind of shot I'd come for. The fog clung to the trees below, creating a sea of white with the mountain peaks poking through like islands. I snapped a few photos, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. When I reviewed the pictures on my camera, my breath caught in my throat. There were figures in the fog. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, just shadows cast by the trees. But the more I zoomed in, the clearer they became. Tall, thin shapes, barely visible but definitely there. Human or something like it, standing motionless among the trees, watching me. I whipped my head around, scanning the valley below. There was no one, just mist and trees. But in the photos, the figures were there. I lowered the camera, heart pounding. I hadn't imagined it. I couldn't have, and yet the air around me felt suddenly cold. Not the kind of cold that comes with a change in the weather. This was different, deeper, like it had seeped into my bones. I should have left right then, packed up, and headed back to the main trail. But I didn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was keeping me here, pulling me deeper into the wilderness. That night, I camped by a small stream. I hadn't seen any more figures, but the unease clung to me like a second skin. I felt like I was being watched constantly. Every time I looked over my shoulder, there was nothing there, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I built a fire, more for comfort than warmth, and tried to distract myself by reviewing the day's photos. That's when I noticed something else. The figures in the fog weren't in just one picture. They were in all of them, some barely visible, others clearer, standing in groups or alone, always watching, always there. My hands started shaking and I nearly dropped the camera. It was impossible. I'd been out there for hours and I hadn't seen anyone. Not a single hiker, no animals, no birds. But there they were, in every shot. Suddenly, the whispering started again. It was louder this time, closer. I stood up, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees. The beam of light cut through the mist, but I couldn't see anything. Still, the whispering grew louder, like it was circling me, coming from all directions at once. You shouldn't be here. That's what it sounded like, a woman's voice, soft but firm, blending with the rustling leaves and flowing water. It wasn't clear, not exactly, but the meaning was clear. I wasn't welcome. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest, and backed toward the tent. The whispering followed me, growing sharper, angrier. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief second, I saw her. She stood at the edge of the trees, tall and thin, dressed in old, ragged clothes. Her face was pale, hollow-eyed, and filled with sorrow. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then, just as quickly as she appeared, she was gone. The flashlight flickered back to life, and the whispering stopped. I didn't sleep that night. By the time dawn broke, I knew I had to leave. This wasn't some trick of the mind. No matter how much I'd tried to rationalize it, there was something in these woods, something angry, and I had trespassed. I packed up my gear in record time and set off toward the trailhead. But the forest seemed different now, like the trees were closing in on me. The path I'd taken to get here was gone, swallowed by the fog. My compass spun wildly, useless, and the map was no help in the unmarked wilderness. Panic gnawed at my insides as I stumbled through the underbrush, trying to keep my bearings. But the more I walked, the more lost I became. And all the while I could feel her watching, waiting. The whispering started again as I crossed a small clearing, louder this time, angrier. I dropped my pack, desperate, and spun around. There she was, standing in the mist, her eyes locked on mine. I fell to my knees, breath coming in ragged gasps. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though my voice was barely audible over the growing wind. "I didn't mean to." Her expression softened just slightly, and for the first time, I felt something other than fear. She wasn't just angry, she was in pain. "I'm sorry," I repeated, louder this time. "I shouldn't be here. I didn't know." The wind died down, the whispering faded, and slowly the figure in the mist began to dissolve, melting back into the fog. I sat there for what felt like hours, heart racing, too afraid to move, but she was gone. The air felt lighter, the forest less oppressive. When I finally stood, I saw it, small, barely visible in the fog, a stone hidden among the trees. A grave, long forgotten, buried deep in the wilderness. I didn't touch it. I didn't even get close. I just stood there for a moment, paying my respects to the spirit I'd disturbed. Then, without looking back, I turned and walked away. I made it out of the Smokies that day, but the images, the figures in the fog, the woman's sorrowful eyes, followed me. I never published the photos from that trip. Some things I realized weren't meant to be captured. Some things were meant to be left alone. My name is Eric Martinez, and it was back in 2018, somewhere near the heart of Olympic National Park in Washington, that I found myself in one of those situations where you can almost hear some cosmic voice mutter, "Oh, you're really in for it now, Eric." I decided to take a much-needed break from work and explore the Pacific Northwest in my recently acquired RV, a modest but sturdy rig I'd lovingly named Gertrude for reasons even I wasn't sure of. It just seemed fitting. Being out there was supposed to be a way to recharge, to get away from the city, the meetings, the 12-hour days. I'd been getting a little burned out, and when you're single and in your 30s, people start assuming you must want to dive into the woods alone to find yourself. So I did just that, telling everyone I'd be off the grid for a week. The park was all towering trees, moss clinging to the branches like it had nowhere else to go, and the occasional moss-covered trail winding into an abyss of ferns and silence. Just walking around, I kept expecting some kind of lumberjack to pop out and remind me I was trespassing. Instead, it was dead silent, which felt equally strange. I'd parked Gertrude in a designated camping area that hadn't seen much foot traffic, exactly what I wanted. It was early morning, the kind of dawn that has you questioning if you're up too early or if the day's just being lazy. I made a lousy pot of coffee on my little stove and decided to take a short hike nearby, leaving my phone, which had no signal anyway, in the RV. The hike started off innocent enough. The trail was muddy and twisted between thick trees that felt more ancient than anything I'd seen in the city. There were no animal sounds, which I thought was odd, but not alarmingly so. It was when I reached a small clearing that I realized how deeply alone I was, and yet there was something well off. The clearing itself looked untouched, pristine even, except for a single old log that had been deliberately moved to sit dead center, creating a kind of seat. On it, an assortment of crude carvings, shapes that didn't quite resemble anything recognizable, but enough to make me feel a strange prickle at the back of my neck. I took a closer look at the carvings, noting the roughness as though they'd been made in haste or by an unsteady hand. Some looked like they'd been there a long time, weathered by the rain. "All right, Eric," I muttered to myself, backing away. Maybe time to head back to Gertrude. I turned and walked back to the trail, but as I retraced my steps, it hit me. I didn't recognize the way back. And I'm pretty good with directions. I wasn't the type to wander off like some lost tourist, but the trees looked unfamiliar, and I realized with an unsettling certainty that I'd somehow drifted off my original route. Stay calm, I thought. You're just off course a little. I could see the faint morning light filtering through the dense trees, so I followed that, moving as straight as I could. After maybe 20 minutes, I began to hear something, a low, rhythmic sound like the hum of machinery. It didn't make any sense. Who would be out here with machinery? Creeping closer, I saw through the trees a small wooden structure, almost hidden among the ferns. I crouched low and approached it carefully. The hum grew louder, and as I got close enough to see clearly, I realized what it was. A generator buzzing away like it had been running forever. Beside it was a makeshift cabin, more of a shed really, but with rough, rusty tools hanging from its walls. It was as if someone had tried to make a home out of a tool shack. Inside, I could make out shapes, dozens of small glass jars lining shelves nailed into the walls. The jars were filled with what looked like tufts of hair, dried leaves, and what I'd swear were small animal bones. My first thought was that I'd stumbled into some eccentric hideaway, like some lone survivalist keeping to himself out here. But then I saw something else, a long metal table stained in dark, rust-colored streaks that left little room for misinterpretation. "What kind of sick?" I whispered, barely daring to breathe. I was about to turn and make a quick, quiet retreat when I heard footsteps behind me, close enough that I felt the crunch of leaves as clearly as if they were under my own boots. I turned, and there he was. A man maybe in his 50s, with unkempt, scraggly hair and a beard that looked like it had never met a razor. He was holding a hunting knife, and his eyes had that gleam, the kind you only see on people who've lost all sense of humanity. "Out for a walk?" he said, smiling in a way that was more predatory than friendly. Yeah, just, out here enjoying nature," I stammered, taking a cautious step back. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his smile fading, replaced by something darker. "Well, I just got a little lost. I'll head back now," I said, trying to keep my tone light, as though I hadn't noticed the knife. But he didn't move, and neither did I. We stood there, the tension stretching between us, until he tilted his head, studying me like I was some stray animal that had wandered into his territory. "You city folk never learn," he muttered, barely loud enough for me to hear, before lunging forward. I stumbled back, adrenaline kicking in as I dodged his first swing, the blade cutting through the air where I'd been a second ago. I grabbed a thick branch from the ground and swung it, catching him across the chest. He grunted, stumbling but didn't fall. He came at me again, and I managed to deflect the knife with the branch, though it nearly broke in half. I took the split-second opening to sprint, not looking back. I could hear him crashing through the underbrush behind me, gaining ground fast. My lungs were burning, every step was a struggle, but I pushed forward, darting between the trees and over rocks, not daring to stop. I heard him curse loudly, probably tripping over something, and that gave me a small, desperate burst of hope. Finally, I spotted a familiar tree, the one with the strange carvings. Relief flooded me. I wasn't far from Gertrude. I didn't stop until I burst out of the tree line, my RV in sight. I stumbled over to it, flinging myself inside and locking the door. I fumbled for my phone, even though I knew there wouldn't be any signal, but something about holding it felt like holding on to some semblance of safety. That's when I heard the footsteps outside the RV. I could see his shadow moving along the side, his breath loud and ragged. "Come out, city boy," he called, his voice practically dripping with menace. "Let's finish what you started." I sat there, heart pounding, holding the closest thing I could find as a weapon, a frying pan. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He banged on the door once, twice, and then he laughed, a guttural, dark laugh that filled the silence. "Thought you could just walk away from this, did you?" he taunted. I knew he'd break the window if he got impatient enough, so I made a decision. I lunged toward the driver's seat, started the engine, and floored it, veering away from the campground as fast as Gertrude could handle. The last I saw of him, he was standing in the road, knife gleaming, a look of fury twisting his face as I sped off. I drove for hours, not caring about direction, only stopping when the RV began to sputter, the gas gauge nearly empty. Pulling into a rundown gas station, I finally felt like I could breathe again. I went inside intending to pay for gas and find some excuse to talk to the clerk about calling the cops. But as I approached the counter, I caught sight of a newspaper clipping pinned to the wall beside it. The headline read, "Unidentified body found in Olympic National Park." The photo was of a different man, but there was a line beneath it that hit me harder than anything else that day. Found near a cabin with extensive signs of ritualistic practices and tools. It said the date on the article was a year old, but the words stuck with me. We thought we knew the Ozarks. Matt swore up and down that Mark Twain National Forest was a hidden gem. Untouched trails, beautiful vistas, perfect for a 3-day backpacking trip. He was always good at selling these kinds of trips, making it seem like a dream adventure. I believed him mostly because I loved him, but even then, as we parked the car at the trailhead and unloaded our gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that this trip was going to be different. "Looks like we're in for some real wilderness this time," Kyle said, flashing a grin. He was already making jokes about getting lost and being eaten by cryptids. Classic Kyle, always trying to lighten the mood. I laughed it off, but something about the dense trees and the isolation made the joke sit heavy in my chest. The forest felt too quiet, too vast. Matt, as usual, was all business. He was adjusting his pack, double-checking the map on his phone. "We'll follow the GPS for most of the way," he said, his voice filled with confidence. "Should be easy, just a couple of tough climbs, but nothing we can't handle." I glanced at Sarah, who was tightening the straps on her hiking boots. She was always the tough one, competitive, never backing down from a challenge. I liked that about her, but sometimes it felt like she had something to prove, especially when Matt was around. I couldn't tell if it was admiration or rivalry. "Let's get moving," Matt called, waving us on. "We've got a lot of ground to cover." The first day went as expected. We hiked deeper into the forest, leaving behind the marked trails and venturing into the heart of the wilderness. The trees were taller here, their branches heavy with green, creating a canopy that let in only slivers of sunlight. It felt like the forest was swallowing us whole, but Matt pressed on, oblivious to the creeping unease that gnawed at me. That night, we set up camp by a small stream. The air was cooler than I expected, a bite of cold that sank into my bones as the sun set. Kyle's tent had a broken pole, something he hadn't noticed until we tried setting it up. He laughed it off, saying he'd just sleep in Sarah's tent, but Matt's frustration was clear. "Next time, check your gear before we leave," Matt snapped, his voice tight. "Relax, man, it's just a tent pole," Kyle said, but the tension between them simmered. I was too tired to deal with their bickering, so I busied myself with starting the fire. Dana, my girlfriend, snapped photos as always, capturing the last glimmers of daylight filtered through the trees. She looked peaceful behind the camera, but I could tell she felt it too, that sense that something was off. That night we heard the first howl. It was distant at first, almost like the wind moving through the trees, but then it came again, low and deep, rising into a chilling wail that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "What the hell was that?" Sarah muttered, her hand instinctively moving toward the hatchet strapped to her pack. Matt shrugged, trying to play it off. "Probably just a coyote or something. These woods are full of wildlife." But it didn't sound like any coyote I'd ever heard. I exchanged a glance with Dana, and she raised her eyebrows in that way she did when she didn't believe something. Kyle, of course, took the opportunity to joke. "Sounds like Bigfoot's out there. Or maybe the Ozark Howler," he said, his voice teasing. "You guys know that one, right? Big hairy creature, glowing red eyes, hunts hikers for fun." "Knock it off," Matt said sharply. "It's just an animal. Get some sleep, we've got a long hike tomorrow." I tried to brush it off too, but lying in our tent that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig outside made my heart race. I must have drifted off at some point, but it was restless sleep. The next morning, Dana told me she'd seen something outside the tent, just for a second, but she was sure of it. Red eyes. "I saw red eyes, Matt," she said softly. I laughed nervously, thinking she must have been half asleep. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, I said, though even I didn't believe it. I hadn't told anyone about the dreams I'd had, the sensation of being watched, hunted, like we were intruding on something that didn't want us there. Day 2 was worse. The forest grew denser, the path less defined, and the GPS signal flickered in and out. At one point, we lost it completely. Matt insisted he could still navigate using the map, but the landscape wasn't matching up with anything. The trees felt wrong, closer somehow, like they were moving in on us. The air grew colder, and the silence pressed down like a weight. "We're lost," Sarah said flatly, glaring at Matt. "We're not lost," he snapped back. "I know where we are." But he didn't. None of us did. That night, we found claw marks on the trees, deep gouges like something had raked through the bark with claws far larger than any animal should have. Dana's hands trembled as she took pictures, but Matt dismissed it. "Could be a bear," he said, though the unease in his voice was obvious. "That's not a bear," Kyle muttered, his earlier joking tone gone. He stared at the claw marks, his face pale. "This is messed up, man. Maybe we should turn back." "We're not turning back," Matt said, his voice rising. "We've come this far. We stick to the plan." The argument that followed was inevitable. Sarah sided with Kyle, saying we were unprepared and it wasn't worth the risk. Dana stayed quiet, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Matt, stubborn as ever, refused to admit we were in over our heads. We set up camp again that night and the howling returned. This time it was closer, louder, the sound reverberating through the trees like something was circling us. I barely slept, and when I did, I dreamt of those red eyes watching us from the darkness. In the morning, we found more signs, animal carcasses torn apart, strewn across the ground, deer, mostly, their bodies mangled in ways that didn't make sense. No predator would kill like that, not for food. It was like something had ripped them apart for fun. Kyle was the first to voice what we were all thinking. "It's the howler, man. I'm telling you, this place is messed up." Matt, as always, refused to believe it. "It's just a predator, wolves maybe." "There are no wolves in the Ozarks," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Not anymore." We kept moving, but the howls followed us, louder, closer. By late afternoon, we knew we weren't alone. We were being hunted. It was just before dusk when we saw it. We stopped to rest, setting our packs down near a small clearing. That's when Dana froze, her camera slipping from her hands. "Matt," she whispered, "behind you." I turned just in time to see it step out of the trees, hulking, shadowy, with glowing red eyes that burned through the dim light. Its body was massive, covered in thick dark fur, but its shape was wrong, twisted like something caught between animal and something more. The howl that followed was like nothing I'd ever heard, a deep, guttural sound that shook me to my core. It didn't charge. It didn't attack. It just stood there, watching, as if daring us to move. We didn't. "What the hell is that?" Kyle's voice was barely a whisper, his face drained of color. "It's not real," Matt muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Dana grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "We have to go," she said, her voice trembling now. The creature tilted its head, almost curious, its red eyes glowing brighter. Then with one last bone-chilling howl, it slipped back into the trees. We didn't wait to see if it would return. We packed up in record time and started moving fast, too fast. The light was fading and we were stumbling over roots and rocks, our breath coming in short, panicked gasps. That night, we didn't set up camp. We just kept walking, desperate to put distance between us and whatever that thing was. The howls continued, closer, always closer. When dawn finally broke, we stumbled upon an old ranger's cabin. Its roof caved in, the windows shattered. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. We collapsed inside, too exhausted to keep going. For the first time in hours, the howling stopped. Matt stared at the floor, his face pale, his hands shaking. "It's not real," he whispered over and over again like a broken record. But we knew better. We had heard it, seen it. The Ozark howler was real, and it had let us live, for now. As we sat in that ruined cabin, the forest watching, waiting, I realized we hadn't escaped. Not really. The howler was still out there, somewhere in the shadows, and it was only a matter of time before it came back. My name's Larry Ward, and back in 2010, I was camped out in a worn-down RV at a spot just off the main road through Badlands National Park, South Dakota. I figured a stint of solitude would clear my head. I'd just gone through a bad breakup, work was eating me alive, and my bank account wasn't doing any better. Getting away felt like the only sane option, and I didn't have the cash for anything fancy, so the RV it was. Now, I'm not what you'd call a great outdoors kind of guy, but I'd grown up in the Midwest, so I'd spent my share of time around prairies, hills, and stretches of nothing. Badlands felt perfect for that kind of escape. Wide and empty with a backdrop of jagged rocks and an endless sky that made me feel smaller than a speck of dust. I liked the idea that no one would be around to remind me of why I'd come here in the first place. The first few days went about as expected. I got up, drank some coffee that tasted like burnt cardboard, and sat outside watching antelope graze in the distance. I spent hours listening to the silence, only interrupted by the dry wind scraping across the rocks and the occasional crow cawing somewhere in the distance. For once, I didn't mind that my phone had no signal. I thought I'd finally get some real peace. One night, things got strange. I was wrapping up for the day, making what barely passed as dinner on a little camping stove outside the RV. The sun had set, leaving a soft glow over the rocky landscape. That's when I noticed something, a flash of light in the distance, just a tiny flicker, like a flashlight way off on one of the trails. People usually don't hike at night out here. People kept to themselves. So, my first thought was maybe a hiker got lost. But when the light went off and on a couple of times, it felt like someone was signaling. I shrugged it off, figuring it was none of my business, probably just some other camper. But the next night, the same thing happened. That flicker of light appeared in the distance, right around the same time, just past dusk. It blinked a few times, then stayed off. This time, I told myself it was the wind catching a bit of glass or some leftover debris left by a passing hiker. But the third night, that's when the whole thing stopped feeling like a coincidence. The light appeared closer, not far off from where I had set up. It was too deliberate. I could make out someone moving, a dark silhouette against the soft, fading light. They weren't wandering or stumbling around. They were walking directly toward the RV. I froze, suddenly all too aware of just how alone I was out here. I hadn't seen anyone in days, and now some stranger was heading straight for me. I went inside, shut the lights, and peered out a tiny window, hoping the darkness would keep me hidden. Whoever it was, they were tall and lanky, moving with a confidence that felt unnatural out here. They had a limp, but moved quickly, determinedly, like the limp didn't slow them down at all. I squinted, trying to see more, but they wore a hooded coat that masked their face. By now, every instinct told me to leave. But that's the thing about being out in the middle of nowhere with no cell signal. You feel trapped, like running isn't an option. I thought if I stayed quiet, maybe they'd just pass by. Maybe they didn't even know I was here. They didn't pass by. Instead, they stopped about 20 yards from my RV and just stood there, like they were waiting for something. They turned their head, scanning the area like they were looking for a sign. Then they pulled something out of their coat, a flashlight, small and silver, the kind you can fit in a pocket, and pointed it straight at my RV. I don't know what possessed me, but I found myself standing up, feeling stupidly indignant, and walked to the door. I swung it open and yelled out, "What do you want?" I don't think I expected an answer. I just wanted to scare them off. But they didn't move. They just stayed there, holding the flashlight steady on me. Then, in a low voice that barely made it to my ears, they said, "You shouldn't be here." For a split second, I thought about telling them the same thing, but then they turned the flashlight off, took a step back, and disappeared into the dark. I barely slept that night. Every creak outside made me jump, and every gust of wind had me imagining shadows creeping up to the RV. Morning couldn't come soon enough, and when it finally did, I stepped outside with a wrench I'd found in the glove compartment, ready to swing if I saw anyone. But no one was there, and all around the RV, the dirt was undisturbed. No footprints, no sign of anyone. The day passed in a haze of paranoia. I kept glancing at the horizon, expecting to see that flashlight again or that figure just standing there. I was half convinced I'd imagined it all, maybe losing my mind after too much time alone. But the next night, I heard footsteps. It was close to midnight, and I was lying in bed, trying to distract myself with a book by the dim light of a camping lantern, Then, like something out of a nightmare, there was a tap on the RV window. Barely there, but unmistakable. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. Tap, tap, and then a voice. "You shouldn't be here." The same low, deliberate whisper. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed that wrench, and threw open the door, yelling into the dark, "Are you crazy? What's your problem?" The beam of a flashlight flicked on, blinding me for a second. When I could finally see, there he was again, the figure standing just outside the RV. This time, he stepped closer, close enough that I could make out his features in the dim light. A scraggly beard, sunken cheeks, and clothes that looked like they hadn't seen a wash in weeks. His eyes were hollow, a kind of emptiness that sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to hold my ground, clutching the wrench tight, but my voice came out shakier than I wanted. "What do you want?" He tilted his head the way a dog might when it hears something strange. "I told you, you shouldn't be here." "Why?" I said. He smiled, his lips curling into a grin that looked anything but friendly. "You're in my spot." "Your spot?" He chuckled low and unsettling, pointing to the ground at his feet. "This is where they all rest," he said, "and I don't like strangers disturbing them." The way he said rest made my stomach twist. I thought he was messing with me, some nut who'd wandered too far from town. But then he pulled something out of his coat, something that glinted in the low light. A knife, long and thin, with a handle wrapped in what looked like leather. He stepped forward and I stepped back, hitting the frame of the door behind me. "Listen, I don't want any trouble," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll leave first thing in the morning." But he shook his head slowly. "Morning's too late," he murmured. "They don't like to wait." He lunged forward, and I stumbled back into the RV, slamming the door shut just in time. The blades scraped against the metal, leaving a thin scratch along the side. I locked the door hard, hammered the keys into the ignition, and ran to the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and I didn't waste a second peeling out of there, gravel spraying as I tore down the dirt road. I didn't look back, didn't dare glance in the mirrors. I drove until the RV was practically on fumes, only stopping when I found a gas station a couple of hours later. My hands were shaking as I got out, looking around like he might still be following me. It was still dark when I arrived at Devil's Tower. The silhouette of the monolith rose above the horizon like a jagged alien structure. The first light of dawn barely touched the sky, but the outline was unmistakable. This place had always felt otherworldly, as if it didn't belong to the same earth the rest of us walked on. I parked the RV in the farthest corner of the campground, away from the few other visitors scattered throughout the park. I wanted isolation, needed it actually, after months of losing myself in work and failing to fix my crumbling marriage. I thought this trip might offer me some clarity. If nothing else, I had my research to keep me focused. Legends of Devil's Tower had fascinated me for years, but one in particular always stuck out. The legend of the Watcher. Native tribes in the region spoke of a spirit that guarded the tower, a being that offered ancient knowledge to those who sought it, but demanded a steep price in return. As a history professor obsessed with ancient folklore, I couldn't resist the lure of that story. I had come to Wyoming to dig deeper into those legends, hoping to uncover something, anything, that might be hiding in the shadows of the tower. I stepped out of the RV, the crisp morning air biting at my skin. The towering spires of pine trees loomed around me, creating an unsettling sense of isolation. I unpacked my gear, set up camp, and grabbed my notebook. The plan was simple: hike around the base of the tower, take some notes, and maybe, just maybe, find something that would finally make all the pieces click. As I set out toward the trail that led to the tower, I passed an older man in a park ranger uniform, grizzled with deep lines etched into his face. His eyes were sharp, though, alert in a way that made me feel like he saw more than the average person. "Morning," he said, tipping his hat. "Morning," I replied, glancing briefly at his name tag. "Tom, you here for the sights or something else?" His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it. I hesitated. "Research, mostly. I'm looking into some of the old Native American stories about the tower." He nodded slowly, his gaze flicking toward Devil's Tower. "The Watcher, huh?" I stopped. I hadn't mentioned that specific legend. He chuckled softly. Everyone comes looking for something. But you do well to leave the watcher alone, son. Some things don't like being disturbed. I tried to brush off his warning with a nervous laugh. You don't really believe that, do you, Tom? He didn't smile. Doesn't matter what I believe. Just be careful. People who go digging too deep around here sometimes find more than they bargain for. With that, he turned and walked back toward the ranger station, leaving me standing there with a pit forming in my stomach. I told myself it was just local superstition, the kind of thing park rangers said to spook tourists. But as I turned my eyes back to the tower, the weight of his words lingered. By midday, I was deep into my hike, circling the base of the tower, taking notes on the surrounding landscape. The towering rock formation loomed overhead, casting long shadows over the forest below. I felt dwarfed by it, like a child standing at the feet of a giant. That's when I noticed the eyes. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a glimmer of sunlight catching on something in the trees. But then I saw them again, faint, glowing orbs between the branches. They were high up, too high to be an animal, and they followed my every movement. I stopped walking, my heart pounding. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move, just hovered there, watching. I wanted to dismiss them as some kind of wildlife, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind them, something intelligent. Forcing myself to continue, I kept walking, occasionally glancing over my shoulder to see if the eyes were still there. They were always just far enough away to keep me wondering, but close enough that I could feel their presence. When I finally made it back to camp, the unease hadn't left me. I sat by the RV trying to write in my notebook, but my mind kept drifting back to the eyes and the trees, the way they'd followed me. Never straying too far, but never coming closer either. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the campground in shadow. The tower loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the purple sky. The fire I'd started crackled weakly, the flames flickering as if they, too, were uncertain about staying here. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. I was a rational man, after all, a professor, a skeptic. But as the night wore on, that skepticism started to feel more like denial. The wind rustled through the trees, and the fire guttered low. Then, just as the last light of the day faded, I heard it. A whistle. It started softly, almost like the wind, but it was too distinct, too deliberate. A single, drawn-out note that drifted through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stood, scanning the darkness. The fire cast faint light around the camp. "Hello?" I called, though I wasn't sure what I expected to hear in return. The whistle came again, sharper this time, closer. I grabbed my flashlight and swung the beam into the trees, but there was nothing. No movement, just the oppressive stillness of the forest. The whistling stopped, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. I sat back down, but sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the RV, every rustle of the trees made me bolt upright, expecting to see those glowing eyes or hear that eerie whistle again. I told myself it was just my imagination, just nerves from being out here alone. But the uneasy feeling stuck with me, settling deep in my bones. The next day, I set out again, hoping to shake the paranoia that had settled over me. I hadn't gone far when I ran into Julie, a solo traveler I'd briefly noticed the day before. She was standing at the edge of the trail, staring up at Devil's Tower, a strange look on her face. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said as I approached, though her tone didn't match her words. There was something off about the way she spoke, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. "Yeah," I replied. "I've been hiking around looking into the old legends. You know about the Watcher?" She turned to me, a slow smile spreading across her face. "The Watcher? You're looking for it?" I nodded, uneasy. "It's just research." Julie's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "The Watcher doesn't like to be found. You know, it watches, but it doesn't want to be seen." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words stuck in my throat. Something about her was wrong. She seemed too calm, too knowing. The way she stared at me made my skin crawl. Before I could say anything else, she turned and walked back toward her campsite, leaving me standing there, heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. That night, the whistling returned, louder this time, persistent. I sat by the fire, gripping my flashlight, eyes darting between the trees. The whistle circled the campsite, moving closer then further away, like it was testing me, toying with me. Then, just beyond the flickering light of the fire, I saw him, a figure tall and gaunt, standing at the edge of the woods. His face was pale, hollow-eyed, and his mouth was pursed as the tuneless whistle drifted from his lips. My throat tightened. "Who are you?" I asked. The figure didn't answer. He just stood there, whistling that same eerie note. My chest tightened with a sudden surge of panic. I stumbled back toward the RV, tripping over a rock and falling to the ground. When I looked up, he was gone. I scrambled inside, locking the door behind me. The sound of my breath was too loud in the confined space. The next morning, I found footprints around the campsite. Small indentations in the dirt, leading in circles around the fire. They hadn't been there before. On the final night, I couldn't take it anymore. The dreams of Devil's Tower had become unbearable. Nightmares of the stone pulsing, breathing like a living thing. I dreamt of eyes, hundreds of them, watching me from the shadows, always watching. I had to go to the tower. I had to see it up close. I grabbed my gear and set out under the cover of darkness, the whistle guiding me, pulling me toward the monolith. The trees seemed to close in around me as I walked, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The stars above twisted and shifted, unfamiliar constellations blinking in and out of existence. As I neared the base of the tower, I saw her again. Julie, standing at the foot of the rock, her face pale and her smile too wide. "The Watcher is waiting," she whispered. "It's always been waiting." The whistle grew louder, piercing through my thoughts, driving me forward. I reached the tower, my hands trembling as I touched the cold stone. And then, out of the shadows, the Watcher appeared. It was a massive shadowy figure, its body indistinguishable from the darkness, but its eyes glowing, burning orbs that stared into me, through me. It didn't speak with words, but its presence filled my mind, offering me ancient knowledge, secrets of the tower, of the universe, of myself. But the price, I could feel it gnawing at the edges of my sanity. The more I listened, the more I realized that accepting its offer would mean losing everything. My mind, my soul, everything that made me, me. I stumbled back, tearing myself away from the Watcher's gaze. The whistle reached a fever pitch and I ran. The ground beneath me shifted and warped as the world collapsed around me. I barely made it back to the RV. When I crossed the threshold, the whistling stopped. The forest fell silent. I drove away as the first light of dawn touched the sky. The image of the Watcher's eyes burned into my mind. I knew I would never be the same. My name's James Harris. It was 2008, and I was on my third night RV camping just outside the Sierra Nevada mountains, not too far from Mono Lake. Now, I wouldn't call myself an outdoorsman by any stretch of the imagination. Honestly, I was more of a stay inside, sip on something warm kind of guy. But a divorce and a midlife crisis will drive you to some weird places. After a decade of city noise, I figured a solo RV trip into the mountains might clear my head. Turns out that kind of peace and quiet isn't always as comforting as you'd think. I'd parked my RV at one of those smaller, secluded campsites where you're more likely to find deer than people, which was kind of the point. The first couple of nights were uneventful, just me, a few beers, and some bad attempts at cooking over a campfire. I'd been telling myself it was the perfect kind of escape, though I'll admit that by night 3, the isolation had started to feel a little less peaceful and more claustrophobic. But what was I going to do? Pack up and head back to the city? Nah, that would have felt like losing. Plus, I was still trying to get used to sleeping in an RV without the constant hum of city life around me. Everything out there was too still. Every tiny crack in the forest made my skin crawl. But hey, what's a little discomfort compared to proving to myself I wasn't totally losing my edge at 42? That night, as I was lying on the RV bed, scrolling through some half-downloaded articles on my phone, I noticed the light outside flicker. Not a campfire glow, something sharper, more precise. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, maybe a reflection of something metallic in the distance. But it happened again, this time closer. I sat up, listening. I wasn't one of those paranoid types, but when you're out alone in the mountains, your mind has a way of turning normal things into, well, not so normal things. For a while, nothing happened. The wind rustled the leaves, an owl hooted off in the distance, the kind of noises you should expect in the middle of nowhere. Then, just as I was about to let it go and settle back into my semi-uncomfortable RV bed, there was a sound. Not the wind, not some critter scurrying about. This was the distinct crunch of footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the trees just beyond my RV. I slid out of bed and peered out the tiny RV window. At first, I didn't see anything, just the pitch-black woods and the faint silhouette of my truck parked beside the RV. But then there it was, a figure standing still, halfway between the trees and my vehicle. At first, I figured it was just another camper who'd wandered over to the wrong site, but then I realized there wasn't supposed to be anyone else this far out. I didn't even hear the sound of another RV or car coming in earlier. I squinted, trying to make out more details. The figure stood there frozen, almost like it was waiting for something. They were tall, lanky, wearing what looked like a dark hoodie, but something felt off. My gut was telling me this wasn't just some lost hiker, and you don't ignore gut feelings out here. I grabbed my flashlight, hesitating before I opened the RV door. There wasn't much else I could do. I didn't own a gun, never really saw the need in the city, and honestly, I'd thought the RV would provide enough protection from whatever the woods had to offer. You know, deer, maybe a curious bear or something, not a strange man lurking outside. The moment I stepped outside, the figure bolted fast. I shined my flashlight in the direction they ran, catching a glimpse of a dirty face, long stringy hair, and something like a wild grin flashing in the dark. But before I could process it, they were gone, disappearing into the thick trees. I wanted to believe that was the end of it, that maybe it was just some vagrant who didn't want trouble, but when I got back inside, something had changed. The flashlight beam caught a reflection on the passenger seat of my RV. My heart sank when I saw it. A large hunting knife jammed into the seat. It wasn't mine. Now I know what you're thinking. How could I have missed someone sneaking into my RV? I couldn't tell you. Maybe I had dozed off earlier, or maybe this guy was just good at what he did. Either way, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I wasn't alone, and whoever this guy was, he had keys. I fumbled for my phone, planning to call the Rangers, but of course, out here, there was no signal. So, like any rational person, I locked every door and window, grabbed the closest thing to a weapon I had, a camping hatchet, and sat in the driver's seat, keeping an eye on the tree line. I wasn't planning on staying the night anymore. First light, I was getting the hell out of there, but first light didn't come fast enough. I must have dozed off at some point, exhaustion overriding my adrenaline, because the next thing I knew, it was around 2 a.m., and the entire RV shook. It wasn't a tree falling or some kind of animal bumping into it. It was deliberate, like someone was trying to force their way in. I jumped up, clutching the hatchet, and shouted out, hoping to scare them off, but the pounding didn't stop. When the door finally flew open, it wasn't subtle. The figure from earlier barreled in, wild and grinning, holding a crowbar. There was no conversation, no demands. He lunged at me immediately, swinging the crowbar, catching me off guard. I swung back with the hatchet, but missed. He was faster than I expected. I won't bore you with the gory details, but let's just say it wasn't one of those quick, clean self-defense moments you see in the movies. I got some good hits in, but not before he bashed me pretty good with the crowbar. Blood was everywhere. His, mine. It all blended together in the chaos. At some point, we both fell out of the RV, and the fight spilled onto the ground. I don't know how, but I got the upper hand, slamming the hatchet down into his chest. The fight stopped then, just like that. I remember standing over him, gasping for air, not really registering what had happened until I saw the light dimming in his wild eyes. He was gone. I staggered back into the RV, dazed, bloody, and in shock. I locked myself inside, not knowing what else to do. Calling for help wasn't an option out here, so I waited. Just me, the dead guy outside, in the silence of the forest. By the time morning rolled around, I was still wide awake, eyes fixed on the body outside. I don't know why I hadn't moved it. Maybe I just needed the daylight to confirm it wasn't some sick nightmare. Eventually, I stepped out, the crisp mountain air biting at my face. I searched the man's pockets, half expecting to find nothing, but there it was. His wallet. His name was Warren Gibson. He was wanted in 3 states for murder, and here I was, alone with his body, no cell service, and a whole mess of questions I didn't have the answers to. The cops eventually found me that afternoon after a couple of hikers came across my bloodied RV and freaked out. They took one look at me, the body, and started asking the usual questions. I don't even remember half of what I told them, just that it was self-defense, which, to be fair, was the truth. Turns out Warren had been squatting in the mountains for years, preying on isolated campers. They'd been looking for him for a long time. Funny thing is, I'd planned this trip to escape the chaos of the city, to find some peace and quiet. I ended up right in the middle of someone else's nightmare. Still, all things considered, I guess I got off easy. Few days surrounded by nature with no emails, no deadlines, just the wild and my camera. I needed this. Chris, my oldest friend, needed it too, though he wasn't much of a camper. I convinced him to come along, figuring the trip might rekindle our bond. We parked my RV at a quiet trailhead miles from the crowded campgrounds. As I unloaded my gear, Chris sat on a rock, fiddling with a bottle of water. "I still don't know why I agreed to this," he muttered, squinting at the dense forest. "It's like the trees are closing in." I laughed. "That's the point, Chris. We're off the grid. Fresh air, peace, maybe even some wildlife for me to photograph." "Yeah, great. Bears, wolves. That sounds peaceful." I ignored him, shouldering my pack. "Come on, it's a short hike. We'll camp near the river." Chris groaned but followed. The trail was narrow, lined with jagged cliffs and thick underbrush. The gorge lived up to its reputation, stunning, rugged, and untamed. But there was something else too. The air felt heavy. I brushed it off, chalking it up to the humidity. By the time we reached the riverbed, the sun was low on the horizon. I paused, staring. Something was wrong. The river was gone. Where there should have been rushing water, there was only cracked, dry earth. Chris stopped beside me, his expression shifting from annoyance to unease. Evan, are you sure this is the spot?" "Positive," I said, pulling out my map. "The river runs right through here." Chris crouched, touching the dry ground. "Looks like it hasn't been here in years." "That's impossible. It was flowing last week." My voice faltered. It didn't make sense. I felt a flicker of doubt, but quickly buried it. "It's probably seasonal," I lied, unwilling to admit how unsettling this was. "Let's set up camp." As night fell, the forest came alive, or rather, it didn't. Normally, the woods buzzed with life, insects, frogs, rustling leaves. Murders me. "Chris, you're being..." I stopped. My camera had just powered down. Frowning, I turned it back on and reviewed the footage from earlier. That's when I saw it. A figure. It was blurry, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably humanoid. It stood at the edge of the frame, hidden among the trees. I blinked, rewound the clip, and zoomed in. The image distorted, the figure disappearing into static. "What's wrong?" Chris asked, noticing my expression. "Nothing," I said quickly, shutting the camera off. "Just a glitch." The first night passed without sleep. I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps circling our campsite, stopping just outside the firelight. Every time I shone my flashlight, there was nothing. Nothing. Chris didn't hear it. He was snoring in his tent, blissfully unaware. The next morning, we met Laura. She appeared suddenly, stepping out from the trees as we packed our gear. Her boots were worn, her hair tied back beneath a bandana. She looked like she belonged here, unlike Chris, who flinched at the sight of her. "Morning," she said, her tone friendly but guarded. "Didn't expect to see anyone this far out." "We're camping," I said, forcing a smile, "doing some photography." She nodded, her dark eyes scanning the dry riverbed. "Strange, isn't it? This river used to run year-round." "You've been here before?" Chris asked. "A few times," she said, "but I stay on the main trails now. This area is different." "Different how?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. She hesitated. "You've heard the stories, right? About the Wendigo?" Chris groaned. "Oh, great, a ghost story. That's what I need." The main corrections were fixing punctuation, especially dialogue formatting, adding missing commas, and ensuring clarity in some sentences. Let me know if you'd like any stylistic tweaks. Before I left, Maggie handed me a small iron charm. For protection, she said, just in case. I returned to the lake feeling more uneasy than I wanted to admit. As night fell, the air grew heavy and an unnatural fog rolled in, obscuring the shoreline. Then the voices started. At first, they were faint, like whispers carried on the wind. But soon they grew louder, more insistent. I couldn't make out the words, but they were definitely calling my name. I stayed inside the RV, clutching the iron charm Maggie had given me. My camera sat on the table, still recording in case anything happened. Around 3 a.m., I saw her. She stood at the edge of the fog, her figure barely visible in the dim light of the moon. Her dress was tattered and dripping wet, her hair hanging in clumps around her pale face, and her hollow, empty eyes were fixed on me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She raised a hand, beckoning me to come closer. The whispers grew deafening, filling the air with an otherworldly hum. I don't know what possessed me to go outside. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was her voice, soft and pleading, calling my name. As I stepped closer to the lake, the fog thickened, wrapping around me like a shroud. The water lapped at the shore, dark and inviting. "Michael," she whispered, her voice a blend of sorrow and rage. She reached out to me, her cold, wet fingers brushing my arm. In that moment, I felt a wave of despair so overwhelming it nearly brought me to my knees. It was like drowning in grief. But then I remembered the charm. I gripped it tightly, its rough edges digging into my palm. The ghost recoiled, letting out a piercing scream that shattered the silence. I stumbled back, breaking free of the fog. I didn't stop running until I was in the driver's seat of my RV, tearing down the dirt road as fast as the vehicle could go. Later, when I reviewed the footage, I saw her again. Her face appearing in the reflections of the lake in the windows of my RV, even in the fog. She was always watching. I uploaded the video, and it went viral. People debated whether it was real or staged, but I didn't care. All I knew was that I would never, ever go back to Goose Lake. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear her voice calling my name. It'd be just another adventure to fuel my travel blog. I've spent the better part of my career exploring hidden gems and offbeat places, but nothing, not even the ghost tours in Savannah or the creepy hotels in New Orleans, could have prepared me for Enchanted Rock. I pulled my RV into the campsite just before noon. Enchanted Rock rose in the distance, a massive pink granite dome that glowed faintly under the Texas sun. I'd been here once as a kid, but I couldn't remember much beyond the climb and my mom yelling at me to stay close. This time I was alone, and I planned to capture every bit of its beauty. After parking in a secluded spot, I grabbed my camera and gear, excited to scout the area. The plan was simple: hike to the summit, take some photos, and interview a few locals about the legends. The place had plenty of them, and ancient curses, ghostly sightings, and strange disappearances. Perfect fodder for a post that would rake in clicks. I checked in at the visitor center where I met Maggie, a park ranger who looked to be in her late 50s. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and had a weathered face that reminded me of an old cowboy movie. "First time here?" she asked, her tone friendly but measured. "First time as an adult," I said, smiling. "I'm a travel writer, and I wanted to cover some of the stories about the rock, the spooky stuff." Her expression shifted slightly. "It's a beautiful place, but you need to respect it, especially after dark." "Why? Is it really haunted?" I teased. She hesitated before answering. "There are things here older than you can imagine. The Tonkawa people believe this was a sacred site. They say a warrior cursed it before he died. Instead, I've seen enough strange things to believe there's truth to it." I laughed nervously. "Well, I'm not planning to anger any spirits." Her gaze lingered on me, her eyes serious. "Just don't wander too far off. And if you hear drumming, go the other way." I dismissed her warning as local folklore meant to entertain tourists, but as I hiked up the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that the rock was watching me. The path twisted through clusters of boulders and dry scrub, the air hot and still. Occasionally, I'd hear a bird or the rustle of a lizard darting through the brush, but otherwise, it was unnervingly quiet. About halfway up, I noticed something strange, symbols etched into the granite. They were rough and jagged, like they'd been scratched in haste, and they didn't look like anything I'd seen before. I snapped a few photos, thinking they'd make for a good mystery in my blog. Then, for no reason I could explain, a chill ran down my spine. It was the middle of the day, blazing hot, but the air felt cold and heavy. I brushed it off as nerves and kept climbing. The corrections are minor, but focus on proper punctuation, consistency with commas, and slight grammar adjustments. Let me know if you'd like further revisions. When I reached the summit, the view was breathtaking. The horizon stretched endlessly, the land below dotted with patches of green and the occasional shimmer of water. I set up my tripod and began taking pictures, losing myself in the work. That's when I heard it, a faint drumming sound carried on the wind. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. It wasn't loud, just a low, steady rhythm, but it seemed to come from all around me. Maggie was just trying to spook you, I muttered, shaking my head. But the sound didn't stop. If anything, it got louder, more insistent. I packed up quickly and started back down the trail, my nerves on edge. The shadows seemed darker now, the shapes of the rocks more menacing. I told myself I was imagining things, that there was a rational explanation for the sound. Maybe someone was drumming at the base of the rock. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I stayed in my RV, editing the photos I'd taken. They were stunning, capturing the eerie beauty of the landscape perfectly. But when I scrolled through the shots of the summit, I stopped cold. In one of the pictures taken at the edge of the overlook, there was a figure. It was faint, barely visible, but unmistakably there. A tall, shadowy shape that hadn't been there when I snapped the shot. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. Was it a trick of the light, a glitch in the camera? I tried to rationalize it, but the memory of that drumming filled my mind, and suddenly I didn't feel so alone. The first knock came around midnight. Soft, tentative, like someone tapping on the side of the RV. My blood turned to ice. I froze, listening. It came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound, like nails dragging across metal. Grabbing a flashlight, I moved to the window and peered outside. The campsite was empty, nothing but shadows and the faint outline of the trees. Then I saw it, etched into the side of the RV, that same symbol I'd seen on the rock earlier that day. My hands trembled as I stepped back, my mind racing. Someone was messing with me. They had to be. But deep down, I knew this wasn't a prank. The next morning, I drove to town and asked around about the symbols. Most people didn't recognize clarity and flow while preserving your original tone and style. Here's the corrected version. "You need to leave," she said, her voice firm. "The rock isn't just a place, it's alive, and you've drawn its attention." "Attention?" I repeated, my stomach sinking. "You've disturbed something that doesn't want to be disturbed." I didn't leave. I should have, but my curiosity and my pride kept me there. That night, the drumming returned, louder and closer than before. The air inside the RV felt suffocating, thick with an invisible weight. I tried to sleep, but kept waking to strange noises, footsteps circling the RV, faint whispers just outside the door. Around 3 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside, determined to confront whatever or whoever was tormenting me. The campsite was shrouded in darkness, the trees casting long, jagged shadows as I shone the light around. At the edge of the clearing, I spotted something, an altar of stones arranged in a circle. In the center lay a bundle of feathers and bones, tied with twine. My breath caught. The drumming grew louder, echoing in my ears. And then I saw him, the shadowy figure from my photo. He stood just beyond the altar, his form shifting and flickering like smoke. "You're not real," I whispered, backing away. "This isn't real." But then he moved, stepping closer. His eyes burned with an unnatural light, and the air grew colder with each step. I stumbled, falling to the ground, and the flashlight rolled out of my hand. "Leave," a voice hissed, deep and guttural, reverberating through the clearing. Scrambling to my feet, I ran back to the RV, slamming the door behind me. The drumming stopped, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. At dawn, I packed up and left without looking back. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figure standing on the summit, watching me. I've written about many places since then, but I'll never return to Enchanted Rock. Some things are meant to remain untouched, their stories told in whispers and warnings. And if you ever visit, take Maggie's advice. If you hear drumming, go the other way. Your writing is already strong and atmospheric. I just adjusted a few things for pacing and impact, but the changes were minimal. Let me know if you want any further refinements. My name's Brian Gibson. Back in 2012, I was working for the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, NAMUS, dealing with one of the oddest cases that had ever crossed my desk, and I'd been at this for almost a decade by then. I thought I'd seen it all until I landed in a remote corner of the Catskill Mountains to look into a case that just kept getting stranger the deeper I went. The details came in rough. Somewhere outside the nearest town of Rosendale, there were reports of 2 campers gone missing, friends, no family connection. Both locals from downstate who had decided to do a weekend trip out of the city. Typical enough, really, until you hit the next part. According to the county sheriff's report, another camper, a guy named Joey Kessler, found their campsite abandoned. Sleeping bags, supplies, tents, still up. He claimed he'd heard something wrong out there, but nothing clear enough to explain what happened to those 2. The way he described it to the deputies sounded like your basic, they just took off situation, so they didn't dig too deep until he finally got pushy enough. Now, normally I'd handle cases like these from a distance. Paperwork, missing persons reports, coordinates for search teams. But something in the initial report bothered me. Joey had been pretty insistent that there was something wrong out there, something he couldn't quite explain. It was vague enough that I chalked it up to his imagination until he described the last thing he'd seen. Footprints. Deep, like someone had just stomped all over the campsite. And then he added, they weren't exactly human either. Curiosity got the better of me. A drive out there, 2 hours from the closest hotel, wasn't too much to ask for a first-hand look. Besides, after staring at paperwork for so long, you start to wonder if you've lost your edge. The sheriff, Grant Winslow, picked me up from the edge of town. He was as haggard and resigned as you'd expect out here. One of those old-timers who didn't see much difference between city folk and the critters running around his forests. He was smoking on the ride, clearly irritated to have another federal type poking around in his woods. "Brian, right?" he asked, glancing over with a kind of squint. "Don't see why they sent you all the way out here. Boys go missing all the time around these parts." "Maybe," I said, but Joey Kessler seemed pretty shaken up, don't you think? "Joey's always shaken up over something," Grant grunted, tossing his cigarette butt out the window. "But yeah, his story this time is a bit odd. So you do what you gotta do. But I tell you, once you set foot in that spot, you'll see there's nothing out of the ordinary. It's a forest. Forests are strange. People just don't belong here." I let the silence settle as we drove the next 30 minutes up into the hills, all the way to the start of a rough trail that would lead us to the campsite. Grant parked the truck and gestured toward the trail. "All right. This way, unless you've got your own map," he said, already heading up. "I'll take the lead," I replied, trying not to let him see that I was itching to get a better look at whatever had spooked Joey. I wasn't a fan of unexplainable things, but I'd come across enough bizarre scenes in my work to know when to trust my gut. And my gut was telling me there was more here than a standard missing persons case. The trail was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The usual chirps, rustles, even the sound of the wind seemed muffled, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Grant seemed to notice too, but he waved it off, grumbling about city types who didn't get how quiet real wilderness could be. I might have let it go if it wasn't for a smell that hit me halfway down the trail. It was faint but unmistakable, something rotten, pungent. I slowed, glancing around for any sign of wildlife or a carcass, but the area looked undisturbed. "Smell that?" I asked Grant, hoping he'd confirm it was just some dead animal. "Dead critter, probably," he muttered. "Let's keep moving. It'll pass." But it didn't pass. If anything, it got stronger as we approached the clearing. And then, after another 100 yards, we found the campsite. The first thing that struck me was how untouched it looked. It was like a frozen snapshot. Everything as it should have been, except for the absolute silence and a lingering chill that felt unnatural. The tent was up, the sleeping bags were inside, and their supplies were scattered around, but not in a way that suggested anyone had been in a hurry. And there, just outside the tent, were the footprints Joey had mentioned. They weren't just footprints. They were deep impressions, larger than any I'd ever seen. Grant crouched down, poking at one with the end of his flashlight. "Hiker with big boots, I'm telling you," he said. But he didn't look convinced. "Looks bigger than any boot I've seen," I replied, crouching next to him, feeling an unease that settled like lead in my gut. There was something unsettlingly precise about the prints, like whoever, or whatever had made them, had been deliberately pressing down, making sure they left a mark. We split up, circling the campsite. I found the tent flap partially open, and inside were the 2 sleeping bags. One zipped up, one open. A flashlight lay in the corner, still covered in mud. I clicked it on, half expecting it not to work, but it flickered weakly to life. It was covered in something sticky and dark. I stared, unwilling to jump to conclusions, but it was hard to ignore the possibility that it was blood. "Grant," I called out, keeping my voice steady. He came over, peering in. His face hardened. "I've seen enough of these things, Brian," he said, voice low. "Kids get themselves hurt out here, or worse. You play with the wild. It plays back." "Sure," I muttered, barely listening. I clicked the flashlight off and set it aside, then glanced over at the edge of the campsite where I noticed something strange. There was a small mound of sticks and stones, oddly deliberate, almost like a marker of some kind. It was the only thing that didn't fit the careless camper vibe, and I couldn't shake the feeling it was meant to be found. Kneeling down, I reached out, intending to brush the mound aside, but Grant grabbed my wrist. "Don't," he said, his grip surprisingly firm. "Look, whatever they were doing here, it's done now. No need to mess with it." I looked at him, surprised by his intensity, but I let it go. "You think they were just out here having fun and got lost?" I asked, feeling the absurdity of the suggestion. But Grant's face remained unreadable. He shrugged and muttered, "People come out here and sometimes they don't come back. Simple as that." Something about his tone sent a chill through me. This wasn't the first case like this he'd seen. Of that I was certain. We spent another hour scouring the campsite, finding only more bizarre details. 2 water bottles, both half empty, abandoned clothes, neatly folded but stashed under rocks, and a compass that didn't point north. By the time the sun began its descent, Grant was getting antsy, insisting we head back. But my gut told me I couldn't just leave. I didn't know what it was, but I felt like I was standing on the edge of something far darker than any routine missing persons case. "Stay back," I told him, my voice edged with a resolve I hadn't intended. He looked at me, puzzled, but stayed quiet as I took a few steps toward the mound. It felt like the temperature dropped. My breaths came out in visible puffs. Grant's face shifted. He was scared. I could tell. But I ignored him, reaching out to brush aside the sticks and stones. And then I found it. A crude symbol scratched into the ground beneath the mound. It was simple but unsettling. 2 interlocking circles with a slash through the center. I'd never seen anything like it, but it felt ancient, wrong. I snapped a photo, then turned to Grant. "Have you seen this before?" He shook his head, but there was a hesitation that told me he wasn't being honest. "What is it, Grant?" I demanded. "Just a symbol. Some of the locals think it's for protection," he said, voice low. He looked around as if expecting something to burst out of the trees. "Folks who know better avoid these spots." He turned, walking back toward the truck, muttering under his breath about cursed places and idiots tempting fate. I let him go, standing alone in the eerie quiet, staring at the mark. I couldn't shake the sense that I'd uncovered something I wasn't supposed to. And then, just as I was turning to leave, I heard it. A faint cry echoing through the trees coming from somewhere deep in the forest. I froze, trying to pinpoint the direction, but it seemed to come from all around me, like the sound was bending with the trees. Against every ounce of reason, I started toward it. The forest grew denser, darker, as I moved farther from the campsite. The trail twisted, the roots clawing at my feet, branches snagging my clothes. And then, just ahead, I spotted something. A tattered piece of fabric caught on a branch. It looked like it had been there for weeks. I grabbed it, feeling the coarse fabric under my fingers. But before I could inspect it closer, the cry came again. This time louder, more urgent. I took off running, pushing through the undergrowth, the smell of decay growing stronger. I stumbled into a clearing, and that's when I saw them. The two missing campers, or what was left of them, lay sprawled across the ground, their bodies mangled and half buried in the dirt. I choked back a gasp, realizing too late that I wasn't alone. A figure stood on the far side of the clearing, half hidden in shadow. Tall. Gaunt. Dressed in a makeshift robe pieced together from scraps of cloth. His face was obscured by a hood, but I could feel his gaze piercing through me, cold and calculating, looking for something. His voice was a rasp, low and cruel. "They wanted to know the secrets of this place," he said, stepping closer. "But some things aren't meant for the curious." In a flash, he lunged, his hand grabbing for something in his robe. I didn't wait to find out what. I turned and bolted, crashing through the forest, heart pounding, lungs burning. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps fast, relentless. But just as he closed in, I spotted the faint glow of Grant's truck up ahead. I stumbled out of the woods, practically throwing myself against the side of the vehicle, pounding on the door. Grant flung it open, eyes wide. "What the hell?" "Go. Go. Now." He didn't hesitate, slamming his foot on the gas, the truck lurching forward as we sped down the mountain road. I didn't look back, didn't breathe until the forest was a distant blur. Grant drove me back to town without a word. When we finally stopped, I turned to him, my voice hoarse. "That symbol. What does it mean?" He hesitated, his gaze dark. "They call it the mark of the seeker. Those who wear it, they aren't like you or me. They're not bound by the same rules." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. I'd come out here looking for answers, and all I'd found was a darkness I couldn't explain. The next day, the sheriff's office found nothing at the campsite. The bodies were gone, the symbol erased like it had never been there. But I knew what I'd seen, and somehow I knew I'd barely scratched the surface of whatever secret lay hidden in those woods. I've always loved the quiet. That's the real reason I camp alone and hike alone. It's not about proving anything to anyone. It's about the silence. The kind of silence that presses against you like a weight, smoothing out the chaos of everyday life. Out here, far from deadlines and the blaring traffic, I can hear my own thoughts. But it's a fragile thing, the peace that the wilderness offers. I've learned that the quiet can also play tricks on you, turn on you. That's what happened to me in the San Juan National Forest. I'd been camping alone plenty of times before, but this trip was different. I still have trouble putting it into words. All I know is that the silence stopped being my friend somewhere on the second day. I'd planned to be out there for 4 days, just long enough to clear my head and reset. The spot I'd picked was remote, a stretch of dense forest near Pagosa Springs that even the locals didn't visit often. It was perfect, or so I thought. The first day went like it always does. The drive up was uneventful, and after a few hours of hiking, I found the perfect campsite. It was tucked away by a creek, surrounded by towering pines, with a small clearing just big enough for my tent and fire pit. I felt that familiar rush of excitement as I set up camp, the freedom of being out here completely alone, with nothing but wilderness around me. That first night was easy. I sat by the fire, listening to the water rush over the rocks in the creek. I wrote in my journal a bit, mostly just notes about the hike and some thoughts about work. Then I crawled into my tent, ready to sleep. The silence was comforting at first, as it always is, but I woke up in the middle of the night to something strange. It was subtle, just a faint whispering sound, like the wind picking up through the trees. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next day, things started to go wrong. I woke up later than I'd planned, the sky already a pale blue overhead. My stove was acting up, which was weird because it had worked fine the night before. It just wouldn't light, no matter what I tried. I ended up eating cold granola and packing up my camp ready to move deeper into the forest. That's when I noticed my GPS wasn't working. I'd had reception when I camped here before, but now my phone was useless. No signal at all. I wasn't worried yet, though. I'd brought a map, and I knew the area well enough to navigate without technology. Still, the feeling that something wasn't right settled in, and I couldn't shake it. The hike was harder than I expected. My legs felt heavier, like the air itself was weighing me down, and the forest was quiet, too quiet. Normally, you'd hear birds or the occasional rustle of squirrels in the underbrush, but today it was just still. The silence felt unnatural. I found another campsite by late afternoon, a little farther into the woods next to a meadow that looked untouched. I set up my tent quickly, eager to get a fire going, but as I worked, the feeling of being watched crept up on me. I couldn't shake it. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, nothing was there, just trees and shadows, but the sensation wouldn't leave. That night, I heard the whispers again. This time, they were louder, clearer, and they weren't random. They were saying something. My name. I sat up in my tent, my heart pounding. The sound was faint but unmistakable, not drifting on the breeze from somewhere just beyond the clearing. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and shone the light into the trees. Nothing. The forest was still, the fire flickering in the corner of my vision. I stood there for a long time, listening, but the whispering had stopped. It was just the wind. It had to be. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the third day, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept much the night before, and the feeling of unease had only grown stronger. My gear wasn't cooperating either. When I tried to pack up my tent, I found that the poles had bent. They were new, barely used, but somehow they were warped, like something had twisted them while I slept. It didn't make sense. The whispering was back too, even during the day. It followed me as I hiked, a faint sound on the edge of hearing, like someone walking just out of sight. I kept telling myself it was the wind, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I wasn't alone out here. Then there was the whistling. It started around midday, just after I'd set up my third camp. At first, I thought it was a bird, but the sound was too deliberate, too human. It came from somewhere deep in the woods, a high, clear note that echoed through the trees. I froze, listening. The sound grew louder, closer, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I called out, hoping it was another hiker, someone who'd stumbled across my camp, but there was no response, just silence. I tried to stay calm, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. Now, it felt like something was circling me, just beyond my vision, waiting. That night, the whispers didn't stop. I lay in my tent, wide awake, listening as the sound of my name drifted through the trees. It was faint at first, like it had been the night before, but as the hours passed, it grew louder, more insistent. Dylan. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The fire had died down, casting long, flickering shadows across the clearing. I scanned the trees, heart racing, but there was nothing, just darkness. I was about to crawl back into my tent when I saw something move, a shadow slipping between the trees. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was too big to be an animal, and it was moving too deliberately, like it was watching me, waiting. I turned off my flashlight and backed into the tent, my mind racing. I'd never been this scared in the woods before, not once in all the years I'd camped alone. But now, there was something out there. I could feel it. I zipped the tent shut and tried to calm my breathing, but the whispers were inside my head now. They weren't just outside, they were all around me. Dylan, Dylan. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in my tent, clutching the flashlight, listening as the whispers circled me. Sometimes it sounded like one voice, sometimes several, but it was always the same soft, insistent calling of my name. By dawn, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. I didn't care where I was going anymore, I just needed to get out of these woods. But as I started hiking, the whistling began again. This time, it was closer, following me like something was walking just behind me, whistling a slow, eerie tune. I didn't stop to look. I didn't want to see whatever it was. I just kept walking faster and faster until I was practically running down the trail. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I froze, heart pounding in my chest, and slowly turned around. There, standing just at the edge of the clearing, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow and its lips were curled into a grin. It stood there, staring at me, its head cocked to the side as if amused. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The whistling had stopped, and now there was only silence. A silence so thick it pressed down on me like a weight. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, waiting. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but eventually I turned and ran. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they were going to burst. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead where my car was parked. When I finally looked back, the figure was gone. I never told anyone what happened in the San Juan National Forest. Not really. I tried to explain it to myself a 1,000 different ways. Exhaustion, anxiety, maybe even altitude sickness. But none of that explains the whispers, or the whistling, or the figure that watched me from the trees. I haven't been camping since. My name is Nathan Matthews, and in the summer of 2000, I found myself parked along a shaded bend of the Lewis River just outside the small town of Cougar, Washington. I'd planned an escape from the corporate life in Portland. It was supposed to be simple. 3 days to recharge, maybe catch some trout, and fall asleep to the quiet of the woods in that RV I bought off a guy in a Costco parking lot. It might not have been luxurious, but it did the trick. This getaway, though, would make me wish I'd gone to a beach instead. The first night was quiet enough. I made myself a lousy meal from a tin can, watched the fire die out, and sat there just listening. After years of cubicles and screen time, just hearing crickets was like a balm. Then, around midnight, I heard something else. A low, rustling sound, like someone shifting leaves around. I brushed it off as a deer or raccoon and got back to my beer. But the noise came closer, staying just outside the glow of my fire. I wasn't about to get spooked by forest critters though, so I headed inside, locked the RV, and settled in for the night. When morning came, things looked pretty normal, except for a strange pile of rocks stacked just outside my door. I'm not talking about little pebbles, but fist-sized stones arranged in a way that felt oddly deliberate. I laughed it off, figuring some teens thought they'd mess with the clueless city guy. I kicked the rocks aside and went fishing. But when I came back a few hours later, the pile was right back there, stacked even higher. I'm not one for superstitions, but that second pile of rocks unsettled me a bit. I half expected to see some local kids running out from the bushes laughing at their prank, but there was no one. I decided to leave it alone and chalked it up to a weird forest quirk or an overactive squirrel. By sunset, though, my nerves were on edge. I tried to ignore it, but every time I looked at the door, that pile seemed bigger in my mind. The second night started much like the first, except my stomach was tight with this gnawing sense of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. After dinner, I put out the fire and decided to keep the lights low inside the RV, figuring that if anyone was messing with me, I'd get a chance to catch them by surprise. That's when I saw movement in the shadows by the riverbank, just a flicker of something shifting behind the trees. I cracked open the window, listening. Silence. But then came that same leaf rustling sound, only louder this time and heavier, like footsteps trying to stay hidden. I cursed myself for not bringing anything stronger than a Swiss Army knife. I'd been too confident, or maybe just too naive, to think I'd need real protection out here. About an hour passed in tense quiet, my eyes darting between the window and the shadows outside. Then, just when I thought I was losing it, I saw him. A figure, tall, gaunt, dressed in a grimy jacket and holding something that looked like an axe. He moved slowly as if he knew exactly how to stay hidden, but wanted to make sure I'd seen him, just enough to keep me guessing. I wasn't about to play his game. I grabbed keys, planning to crank up the RV and get the hell out of there. But when I reached the driver's seat, I noticed the tires. Both front tires had been slashed. My heart pounded as I forced myself to think. He was out there, and he'd clearly planned this. I decided to turn all the lights off, lock the doors, and sit low, hoping he'd get bored and leave. The minutes crawled by, and I could hear him pacing around, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel just outside. At one point, he stopped, and I heard a soft tapping on the window, like he was checking if I was inside. And then he started laughing, a low, guttural chuckle that sent a chill through me. The laugh was calm, like he knew he had all the time in the world and nowhere else to be. I was a city guy in an RV with slashed tires, miles from anyone who would hear me scream. I'd never felt so exposed, so helpless. Hours passed. At some point, the tapping and pacing stopped, but I was too scared to check outside. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, dawn was filtering through the thin RV curtains, casting a weak light on the chaos around me. My camp chairs were overturned, my fishing rod bent and snapped in two. There was mud smeared in thick lines across the windows, like he'd dragged his hands all over them, leaving these thick, dark smudges. I felt a wave of nausea hit me, but I steeled myself and opened the door. The rocks were there again, stacked up to chest height this time, right in front of the RV. But now they had something resting on top of them. A rusty old hatchet with dark stains on the blade. The sight of it made my stomach churn. Whoever he was, he wanted me to know he wasn't just playing around anymore. I stumbled back into the RV, my mind racing. I had to get out of there, even if it meant trekking through the woods to find help. I grabbed a backpack, loaded it with water, a map, and the Swiss Army knife, and took one last look outside. The morning was still and eerily quiet, like the forest itself was holding its breath. As I stepped out, something caught my eye. A scrap of cloth snagged on a nearby branch. It looked like a piece of that filthy jacket the man had been wearing. I didn't want to follow the trail, but it was the only lead I had. So I steeled myself and headed in that direction. The path twisted and wound deeper into the woods, and I could feel the air grow colder, the trees pressing in on all sides. After what felt like hours, I came upon a clearing with an old, dilapidated shack. The door was slightly ajar, and a rancid smell seeped out, filling the clearing with a sickly stench that made me gag. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer, heart pounding, every nerve screaming at me to turn back. But there was something inside, a figure barely visible in the gloom. It was him, sitting on a rickety chair, cradling something in his lap, a cracked, worn journal. He didn't move, didn't look up, just kept flipping through the pages, muttering under his breath. I took a step back, but something crunched under my foot, a broken bone, splintered and scattered across the floor. My eyes adjusted and I saw them, rows and rows of bones, arranged in patterns around the room like some kind of macabre decoration. My heart hammered as he looked up, his eyes dark, cold, and utterly devoid of life. He stood, holding that rusted hatchet. My instincts kicked in, and I bolted. I didn't stop, didn't look back. Branches whipped at my face and rocks tore at my shoes, but I kept running, fueled by sheer terror. When I finally burst through the trees back to my RV, I didn't waste a second. I threw the backpack inside, climbed in, and locked every door and window I could. That hatchet was gone from the pile of rocks, and I didn't dare think about what he'd intended with it. As I sat there trying to calm my breathing, I caught sight of a small scrap of paper wedged under my windshield wiper. With trembling hands, I opened the door and grabbed it. The note was scrawled in a barely legible hand. "This isn't over." I'd later find out from a local ranger that a man fitting his description had a record, a twisted history of stalking and tormenting campers in the area, using those rocks and bones as markers, warning signs. They'd tried catching him before, but he was always one step ahead. The ranger told me he went by a name I'll never forget, Evan Calder. The kind of nightmare you don't just walk away from. My name is Mary Bryant. I'm 33 years old, and this happened last October in Blackwater Falls State Park, West Virginia. I had just landed my first solo freelance assignment, a travel feature for an outdoor magazine. It was my chance to prove to myself, and maybe to a few others, that I could thrive on my own after leaving a toxic relationship. I didn't expect the park's breathtaking beauty to be marred by whispers of the past, or that those whispers would grow louder with each passing night. When I first arrived, the park was everything I'd hoped for. My RV fit snugly into a secluded campsite overlooking the gorge, the roar of the falls constant in the distance. Blackwater Falls was a photographer's dream. Cascading water, mist rising through the gorge, and vibrant autumn foliage painted in fiery reds and oranges. The first day was perfect. I hiked, shot hundreds of photos, and scribbled notes about the trails and wildlife. The peace and quiet were a balm, exactly what I needed after months of turmoil. That evening, I sat by the fire, sipping tea and scrolling through my shots. That's when I saw it for the first time. At the edge of one frame, a figure stood between two trees. It was a man, his clothes ragged and his face shattered. I frowned, zooming in, but the details remained blurred. I didn't remember seeing anyone during my hike, and the figure hadn't appeared in any other photos. I shook it off as an optical illusion, probably a trick of light and shadows, and went to bed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The second day brought strange encounters. I started the morning by stopping at the visitor center, hoping to get some local insight. The woman behind the counter, Maggie, was friendly, but seemed to be watching me too closely. She eyed my camera gear and smiled knowingly. "Planning to photograph the falls?" she asked. "That's the idea," I replied. Maggie hesitated, her smile faltering. "Be careful around the falls, especially near dusk. The dead don't like company." I blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" Before I could ask more, she turned to help another guest, leaving me with a vague unease. Later on a trail to the falls, I ran into Gary, a park ranger. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and a genial demeanor. As he gave me a quick overview of the park's history, I brought up Maggie's warning. He chuckled. "Oh, that's just local folklore. Back in the Civil War, there was a Confederate soldier who hid out in the gorge. They say he deserted his regiment and was hunted down near the falls. Some folks claim his spirit never left, but I've worked here for years and never seen a thing." I tried to laugh with him, but his words stayed with me. That evening, the first real sign of something unnatural occurred. I set up my tripod near the falls, hoping to capture the golden hour light. As I framed the shot, my breath caught. The air around me had turned frigid, my breath fogging in front of me despite the mild weather. My camera refused to focus, the lens shuddering as if something was blocking it. And then, faint but unmistakable, I heard whispers. I spun around, expecting to see other hikers, but I was alone. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and indecipherable, like a crowd speaking just out of earshot. The unease became unbearable, and I packed up in a rush, leaving the falls as the last light of day faded. That night, back at the RV, I reviewed the day's photos. Most were stunning. The falls bathed in warm golden light, but in 3 of them, the figure from the previous day appeared again. This time he was closer, standing at the edge of the water. His face was clearer now, pale, gaunt, with dark hollows where his eyes should have been. And in the last photo, he was staring directly at the camera. I slammed my laptop shut and locked the RV door. The next morning, I debated cutting the trip short, but a part of me couldn't let it go. I'd always prided myself on being rational, and I wasn't going to let a few strange occurrences ruin my assignment. While hiking near the falls, I noticed an overgrown side trail. Curiosity tugged at me, and I followed it, ducking beneath low-hanging branches. It led to a clearing where the air felt heavier, almost oppressive. In the center of the clearing was a patch of disturbed earth, as though something had been buried there long ago. Nearby, I found an object half buried in the dirt, a weathered leather journal. The pages were brittle but legible. Written in a looping, old-fashioned script, the entries told the story of a Confederate soldier who had deserted his regiment and fled into the gorge. His words were filled with fear and desperation. "The nights grow colder and I hear them coming. I cannot outrun my fate," the last entry read. "They will find me tonight. I will not see another sunrise." I closed the journal, my hands trembling. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the oppressive feeling returned. The RV's lights flickered, and shadows danced across the walls, moving in ways that didn't match the firelight outside. And then I saw him. The soldier stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. He didn't move, didn't blink, but his hollow eyes locked onto mine. My chest tightened with fear as I realized he wasn't alone. Shadows emerged from the trees, darker and more twisted. Their forms writhing like smoke, they whispered accusations, voices overlapping in a cacophony. "Traitor. Coward. You will not leave." Panicking, I grabbed the journal and held it up. "Is this what you want?" I shouted. The soldier's expression shifted, sadness, perhaps gratitude, and he gestured toward the disturbed earth I'd seen earlier. I understood. Clutching the journal, I ran back to the clearing. The shadows followed, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. My hands shook as I placed the journal on the grave and whispered a quiet prayer for peace. The air around me grew still. The shadows stopped, their forms dissolving into the night. The soldier lingered for a moment longer, his hollow eyes softening, before fading into the mist. By morning, the oppressive feeling had lifted. The forest seemed brighter, the air lighter, and for the first time in days, I felt safe. Before leaving, I stopped at the visitor center to return the journal. Maggie was there, her knowing smile greeting me. "You helped him, didn't you?" she asked, her voice soft. I nodded, unsure how to respond. She reached out, patting my hand. "He's free now. You did a good thing." As I drove away from Blackwater Falls, I realized the experience had changed me. I didn't have all the answers, but I no longer felt the weight of doubt and fear that had followed me into the park. Sometimes the past lingers in ways we can't explain, and sometimes all it takes to move forward is to lay it to rest.